Crowns glitter, bells ring, carriages roll. But behind the silk gowns and royal smiles lie marriages built on secrets, pressure, obsession, and sacrifice. Some vows were whispered too soon. Others were spoken with dread. A few changed the course of history forever. Tonight, we're pulling back the velvet curtain on 25 of the most famous British royal marriages, not to relive fairy tales, but to expose the shocking truths hidden behind them. Because when power meets love, the truth is rarely romantic and never simple. Before we begin, take a second to subscribe if you enjoy uncovering the real stories behind history's most powerful families. And let us know in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it for you right now? We love seeing how far these royal stories travel. 1. Prince Charles and Lady Diana Spencer, 1981. On the morning of July 29, 1981, the world believed it was witnessing the purest modern fairy tale royalty could still produce. A shy kindergarten assistant stepped into a glass coach, a future king waited nervously at the altar, and nearly 1 billion people watched as Prince Charles married Lady Diana Spencer inside St. Paul's Cathedral. It was called the wedding of the century, a moment so polished and grand that it seemed to freeze time itself. Yet beneath the silk, the pearls, and the orchestrated perfection, the ceremony already carried the quiet fingerprints of human nerves, royal pressure, and a revealing mistake that hinted at everything to come. Diana was just 20 years old. She had been thrust into a role few adults could have handled gracefully, let alone someone barely out of her teens. The expectations were immense. She was expected to embody tradition, youth, beauty, obedience, and warmth, all while being watched by the most powerful monarchy in the world. Inside St. Paul's, the echoing space magnified every breath, every pause, and every word. Diana later admitted she was terrified. Her heart raced, her hands shook. And then came the moment that history would quietly remember. As she reached the most sacred part of the vows, Diana misspoke. Instead of saying, Charles Philip Arthur George, the correct order of the Prince of Wales's names, she reversed them and said, Philip Charles Arthur George. On paper, it was a small error. In symbolism, it was enormous. Philip was not the groom. Philip was Charles's father. In front of the Archbishop, the royal family, and millions watching live, Diana had, in effect, pledged herself to the wrong man. The mistake was not malicious, nor was it mocked at the time. In fact, many people missed it entirely. But among those who noticed, especially within royal circles, it became a strangely fitting metaphor. Diana was entering a family with rigid hierarchies, unwritten rules, and emotional distances she barely understood. She was marrying a man already shaped by duty, expectation, and a powerful paternal shadow. The slip revealed how unnatural the entire spectacle was for her, a young woman performing perfection under suffocating pressure. This was not the only sign of unease that day. Charles reportedly looked visibly anxious throughout the ceremony. Their interactions were formal, restrained, and lacking the spontaneous warmth people expected from a love match. Off camera, it later emerged that Diana had felt deeply insecure in the days leading up to the wedding. She was aware that Charles maintained a close emotional connection with Camilla Parker Bowles, and although the public narrative framed Diana as the triumphant bride, privately she felt like an outsider stepping into a story that had already begun without her. The dress itself became both icon and armor. Designed by David and Elizabeth Emanuel, it featured 10,000 pearls, antique lace, and a train so long it barely fit inside the coach. Diana joked afterward that she barely remembered walking because she was so focused on not tripping. The gown was meant to project confidence and majesty, yet it also trapped her physically, forcing her to move slowly, deliberately, carefully, much like the role she was stepping into. Even her body language during the ceremony reflected this tension. Shoulders slightly hunched, eyes downcast, movements cautious rather than celebratory. Despite this, The public adored her instantly. Diana smiled shyly, waved gently, and radiated a vulnerability that contrasted sharply with royal stiffness. She seemed real in a world of ritual. That humanity made her beloved, but it also made her exposed. The vow mistake, while innocent, symbolized how little room there was for imperfection in royal life, and how brutally such imperfections could echo later. In the years that followed, commentators would look back on that moment with eerie fascination. Some saw it as an omen, others dismissed it as nerves. Diana herself later reflected on how overwhelming the day had been, describing it not as a beginning of happiness, but as the start of something she didn't yet understand. The fairy tale, as it turned out, had been written before she arrived, and she was expected to read her lines flawlessly without ever being handed the script. What makes this moment so compelling is not the mistake itself, but the environment that caused it. No ordinary bride recites vows before global cameras, surrounded by centuries of expectation. Diana's slip humanized the entire spectacle. It cracked the polished surface just enough to reveal the pressure beneath. It reminded the world that even the most choreographed royal moments are still lived by people with trembling voices and racing hearts. And perhaps most striking of all, the moment contrasts sharply with what royal weddings would become decades later. As the monarchy slowly learned from its past, future royal brides would be given more freedom, more control, and more emotional space. The rigid formality that overwhelmed Diana would soften, replaced by ceremonies that felt more personal, more relaxed, and more authentic. That transformation becomes especially clear when we move forward one generation to a wedding that looked outwardly just as grand, but inwardly was shaped by choice rather than pressure. When Prince William prepared to marry Catherine Middleton, the echoes of his parents' wedding were impossible to ignore. But this time, the story unfolded very differently. 2. Prince William and Catherine Middleton, 2011. When Prince William married Catherine Middleton on April 29, 2011, the world once again gathered to witness a royal wedding. But this time, the atmosphere felt strikingly different. The setting was just as historic, the guests just as elite, and the global audience just as vast. Yet beneath the grandeur of Westminster Abbey, there was a noticeable shift in tone. This was not a fairy tale imposed from above. It was a partnership shaped slowly, deliberately, and on the couple's own terms. And nowhere was that difference more quietly revealed than in one surprisingly personal decision made by the bride herself. Catherine Middleton, soon to be known as the Duchess of Cambridge, had spent nearly a decade in the public eye before the wedding. She was scrutinized relentlessly. Her clothes, her posture, her weight, her facial expressions. Every detail was analyzed, often unfairly, as she transitioned from a private citizen into a future queen consort. By the time her wedding day arrived, she understood better than anyone what it meant to be watched. And yet, in the most visible moment of her life, she made a choice that ran counter to royal tradition and expectation. She did her own makeup. This was not a last-minute decision or an act of stubborn independence. Kate approached it with characteristic preparation. She reportedly took professional lessons from a makeup artist beforehand, learning techniques that would work under harsh lighting, long hours, and intense scrutiny. But when the day came, she insisted on applying the final look herself. It was subtle, balanced, and unmistakably her. Not overly dramatic, not overly restrained, simply familiar. Those close to her later noted that it was important to Kate that Prince William recognize her instantly when she walked down the aisle, not as a constructed royal figure, but as the woman he had known for years. In the context of royal weddings, this choice was quietly revolutionary. Royal brides traditionally rely on teams of stylists, dressers, and beauty experts, all working to project an image carefully aligned with the institution. Kate had access to the very best in the world, yet she deliberately retained control over this one intimate detail. It was a statement without words. She was stepping into royal life, but not surrendering her identity entirely. The contrast with previous generations was impossible to miss. William had grown up witnessing the consequences of overwhelming pressure placed on a young bride. His mother's wedding had been majestic but rigid, flawless on the surface, and deeply constraining beneath it. William was determined that his own marriage would not repeat those patterns. He and Kate approached their relationship as equals, shaped by years of shared experiences, from university life to long periods apart due to military service. By the time they stood at the altar, they were not strangers performing roles. They were partners who had already navigated public scrutiny together. The wedding itself reflected this balance between tradition and modernity. Westminster Abbey provided historical weight, yet the ceremony felt warmer and more relaxed than royal weddings of the past. William smiled openly. Kate appeared calm, composed, and confident. Their interaction was natural, filled with small glances and shared moments that cameras caught effortlessly. There was no sense of nerves overwhelming the occasion, no feeling that one partner was being ushered into an unfamiliar world without preparation. Kate's makeup choice also symbolized something broader about the monarchy's evolving image. By 2011, the royal family understood that public affection could not be commanded. It had to be earned through relatability. Kate's decision resonated with millions of viewers precisely because it felt human. It suggested trust in herself, comfort with who she was, and an unwillingness to be transformed entirely by ceremony. For many, it was a subtle but powerful reminder that royal life no longer had to erase individuality. Even the aftermath reinforced this perception. Kate did not dramatically alter her style overnight. She continued to dress with restraint and consistency, developing a recognizable aesthetic rather than reinventing herself for each appearance. The same confidence that led her to apply her own makeup on her wedding day became a defining feature of her public role. She moved forward deliberately, without haste, aware that longevity, not spectacle, was the true test of a royal marriage. Looking back, the choice seems small. Makeup washes off, photographs fade. But in the rigid world of royal symbolism, small choices often speak the loudest. Kate's decision told the world that this marriage was not about performance alone. It was about continuity, stability, and emotional grounding. It suggested a future in which royal spouses could participate without disappearing. And yet, as calm and modern as this wedding appeared, it was still shaped by history, by wartime sacrifices, inherited duty, and traditions forged long before William and Kate were born. To truly understand how royal marriages evolved to allow such personal freedom, we must step back to a time when even a future queen had to queue, save, and sacrifice like everyone else. The story of Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip reveals how love and duty were tested under circumstances far more austere than pageantry ever suggested. If you're enjoying these hidden royal truths so far, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the rest of this series. And while you're here, tell us in the comments, where are you listening from and what time is it for you right now? It's fascinating to see how far these stories reach. 3. Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip, 1947. When Princess Elizabeth married Lieutenant Philip Mountbatten on November 20, 1947, there was celebration, but there was also exhaustion, scarcity, and lingering trauma from war. Britain was still rationing food, clothing, and basic necessities after World War II. Cities bore bomb scars, families were rebuilding, and luxury was not just frowned upon, it was often impossible. Yet in the middle of this restrained, recovering nation, the future Queen of the United Kingdom prepared for a wedding that would quietly redefine what royal duty looked like in an age of austerity. The most surprising truth about Elizabeth's wedding was not the grandeur of the ceremony at Westminster Abbey, but how limited her resources actually were. Despite being heir presumptive to the throne, she did not receive unlimited privileges. Like every other British woman at the time, Elizabeth required ration coupons to purchase fabric for clothing. Her wedding dress, destined to become one of the most famous gowns in history, could not simply be ordered without constraint. She needed coupons. The government eventually granted her 200 additional clothing coupons, a rare but necessary exception. Even so, the symbolism was striking. A future queen navigating the same bureaucratic system as her subjects. The dress itself, designed by Norman Hartnell, was elegant but carefully justified. It featured ivory silk satin from China, pearls sourced from the United States, and embroidery inspired by Botticelli paintings, symbols of rebirth and hope. But behind the artistry was strict compliance with post-war rules. There was no excess, no indulgence beyond what could be defended publicly. Perhaps most moving of all was the public response. Women across Britain began mailing their own ration coupons to the palace, hoping to help Elizabeth complete her dress. It was an extraordinary gesture of solidarity, born from shared hardship. Every single coupon had to be returned. Transferring ration coupons was illegal, even for a princess. Elizabeth insisted the law be followed to the letter. The moment reinforced something fundamental about her character. Rules applied to her because they applied to everyone. The wedding itself reflected this tone of quiet restraint. While grand by necessity, it was not extravagant by royal standards. Decorations were tasteful, food was modest, and the guest list, though impressive, avoided unnecessary excess. Elizabeth wore pearls borrowed from the Queen, and her tiara famously snapped shortly before the ceremony, requiring a last-minute repair. Rather than panic, she waited calmly, an early glimpse of the composure that would define her reign. Philip, meanwhile, had made significant sacrifices of his own. Born a prince of Greece and Denmark, he renounced his foreign titles, converted religions, and adopted British citizenship to marry Elizabeth. He arrived at the altar not as a royal outsider demanding privilege, but as a naval officer who had served throughout the war. Their union was built on shared experience, mutual respect, and a strong sense of responsibility, qualities that would become increasingly important as Elizabeth's role expanded beyond anything either of them initially imagined. Unlike many royal marriages of the past, this was not an arranged political match. Elizabeth had chosen Philip years earlier and refused to be dissuaded, despite concerns from advisors about his background and temperament. She was deeply devoted, and for once the monarchy bent to personal will rather than tradition. That decision would shape the rest of her life. When Elizabeth ascended the throne just 5 years later, Philip was required to step back from his naval career and redefine himself as consort to a reigning queen, an unprecedented challenge for a man raised in rigid military hierarchy. In hindsight, the ration coupon wedding feels like a perfect metaphor for their marriage. It was not flashy, but it was durable. It was built under pressure, tested by circumstance, and grounded in discipline rather than illusion. While later royal weddings would sparkle with modern luxury, Elizabeth and Philip's union was forged during a moment when restraint was a national virtue. That shared beginning mattered. It shaped Elizabeth's understanding of leadership as service rather than spectacle. It anchored her relationship with the public in empathy rather than distance. And it established a royal marriage that would last over 7 decades, weathering scandal, change, and global transformation. Yet as the monarchy moved further into the modern age, royal marriages began to absorb influences from far beyond palace walls. Love stories crossed oceans, traditions bent under cultural change, and symbolism became increasingly personal rather than institutional. That evolution reaches a striking new chapter when a British prince falls in love with an American actress, bringing not just romance but a completely different idea of what a royal wedding could mean. 4. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, 2018. When Prince Harry married Meghan Markle on May 19, 2018, it was immediately clear that this royal wedding belonged to a different era. From the guest list to the sermon, from the music to the bride herself, the ceremony at St. George's Chapel felt unlike anything the British monarchy had staged before. Yet amid the global headlines about modernity, diversity, and change, One of the most revealing details of the marriage was almost invisible, stitched quietly into the bride's veil, unseen by cameras and unnoticed by most observers. Meghan's something blue was not jewelry, not embroidery, and not a traditional keepsake passed down through royal generations. Instead, it was a small piece of blue fabric taken from the dress she wore on her very first date with Prince Harry. That fragment, cut from an ordinary outfit worn long before titles and tiaras entered the picture, was sewn discreetly into her veil. It was deeply personal, intentionally hidden, and symbolically powerful. In a wedding watched by millions, Meghan chose to carry a private memory that belonged only to the two of them. This choice reflected the nature of their relationship from the very beginning. Harry and Meghan's courtship unfolded largely outside the rigid framework of royal expectation. They met through mutual friends, dated privately for months, and bonded over shared values rather than shared pedigree. By the time their relationship became public, Harry was already determined to protect it from the pressures that had scarred previous generations. The veil detail perfectly captured that instinct, a quiet assertion that the marriage was rooted in real life, not royal performance. The wedding itself reinforced this message repeatedly. Meghan walked part of the aisle alone, a subtle departure from tradition that emphasized independence rather than transfer of ownership. The service featured a gospel choir and a sermon delivered with emotional warmth rarely seen at royal ceremonies. Even the guest list reflected Harry and Meghan's world beyond aristocracy, including actors, athletes, and activists alongside dukes and duchesses. The monarchy was, for once, visibly adapting rather than directing. Meghan's dress, designed by Claire Waite Keller for Givenchy, was deliberately minimalist. There were no heavy embellishments, no overwhelming embroidery, no dramatic flourishes. The veil, however, told a different story. It was embroidered with floral symbols representing all 53 Commonwealth nations, a nod to duty and inclusivity. And hidden within that grand symbolism was the small blue fragment from her past, a reminder that this marriage was not created by institution, but by choice. That contrast between public symbolism and private meaning defined Harry and Meghan's union. Harry, long seen as the more rebellious royal, had spent years carving out his own identity beyond palace walls. Meghan, an American actress accustomed to independence, was not content to disappear into ceremonial anonymity. Together they attempted to merge personal authenticity with royal expectation, often in ways that unsettled traditionalists. In retrospect, the hidden something blue feels almost prophetic. It represented a desire to preserve a piece of their pre-royal life, a reminder of who they were before scrutiny intensified. As their marriage progressed, the tension between personal autonomy and institutional constraint became increasingly visible. What began as subtle personalization eventually grew into a broader struggle over boundaries, roles, and control. Yet on the wedding day itself, optimism reigned. Harry looked visibly emotional, smiling broadly as Meghan approached. Their interactions were affectionate and relaxed, marked by whispered exchanges and shared glances. The atmosphere was warmer, more expressive, and less restrained than many royal weddings before it. To many viewers, it felt like a refreshing evolution, proof that the monarchy could embrace individuality without losing dignity. What made Meghan's hidden keepsake so compelling was its invisibility. It wasn't meant to be seen or admired, it was meant to be felt. In a world where royal symbols are usually designed for public consumption, this one existed purely for emotional grounding. It anchored the ceremony to a private moment long before crowds, cameras, and global debate entered their lives. As with many royal marriages, time would complicate the initial promise. But the wedding itself remains a fascinating snapshot of transition, an ancient institution briefly bending to accommodate modern love, personal narrative, and quiet defiance. The veil's secret encapsulated that moment perfectly. beautiful, symbolic, and deliberately understated. And yet, for all its modern touches, this wedding was still shaped by royal tradition in ways large and small. Some customs remained untouched, while others were subtly rewritten. To see how tradition and novelty sometimes collide in unexpected ways, we must turn to another royal marriage from the same era, one where even the bride's floral crown concealed a secret designed for practicality rather than symbolism. 5. Prince Andrew and Sarah Ferguson, 1986. When Prince Andrew married Sarah Ferguson on July 23, 1986, the wedding was framed as a return to exuberance for the royal family. The groom was known as the Queen's favorite son, handsome, confident, and newly celebrated as a war hero after his service in the Falklands conflict. The bride, with her bright red hair and unfiltered laugh, was instantly labeled fun, a sharp contrast to the more restrained royal figures the public was used to seeing. Their wedding at Westminster Abbey felt energetic, youthful, and unapologetically joyful. But hidden among the roses and pageantry was a detail so practical, so unexpected, that it perfectly captured both Sarah Ferguson's personality and the peculiar demands of royal life. Sarah Ferguson's flower crown wasn't just decorative. Tucked discreetly into her floral headpiece was a small, carefully designed mechanism meant to hold a cotton pad soaked in her perfume. The idea was simple but ingenious. Rather than relying on reapplication or scent fading under bright lights and long hours, Sarah ensured she would smell pleasant throughout the entire ceremony and celebrations, without ever needing to step away. It was a solution born of nerves, self-awareness, and an understanding that royal weddings are endurance events as much as romantic milestones. At first glance, the detail seems charming, even humorous. But it also reveals how intensely scrutinized royal brides are, down to how they look, how they move, and yes, how they smell. Sarah was acutely aware that her wedding would involve hours of walking, standing, greeting, and being physically close to others. Cameras would capture her from every angle. The Abbey would be crowded, warm, and overwhelming. Rather than leave something so basic to chance, she prepared for it with the same determination that defined much of her early royal image. Unlike many royal brides before her, Sarah did not come from a background steeped in palace discipline. She had grown up in a less formal aristocratic environment and was known for her spontaneity and humor. That spontaneity sometimes clashed with royal expectations, but on her wedding day, it translated into clever foresight rather than rebellion. The perfume mechanism was invisible, discreet, and effective, a quiet reminder that even the most traditional ceremonies are navigated by individuals with very human concerns. The wedding itself reinforced this sense of approachability. Sarah's gown, designed by Linka Sierak, featured a fitted bodice and full skirt, elegant but less severe than earlier royal dresses. She smiled broadly, laughed openly, and appeared genuinely thrilled rather than solemnly composed. Andrew, equally relaxed, greeted guests with ease and confidence. Together they projected warmth rather than restraint, signaling a royal couple eager to connect emotionally with the public. For a time it worked. Sarah became wildly popular, nicknamed Fergie by the press, and praised for bringing humor and relatability into royal life. The perfume detail fit neatly into that narrative. It wasn't about tradition or symbolism. It was about comfort, practicality, and self-assurance. In a world where royal brides were often expected to endure discomfort silently, Sarah quietly optimized the experience instead. Yet in hindsight, the detail also reflects something deeper about her place within the institution. Sarah would later struggle with the rigid boundaries and relentless scrutiny of royal expectations. Her openness, which initially endeared her to the public, eventually became a source of tension. The same personality that led her to think practically about a long wedding day also made it difficult for her to conform to an environment that prized restraint above authenticity. The marriage itself would face challenges almost immediately. Andrew's naval career kept him away for long stretches. leaving Sarah isolated within an institution she never fully understood. While the perfume mechanism speaks to preparedness, it also hints at how much unseen labor royal spouses perform simply to get through public appearances smoothly. Comfort, confidence, and small coping strategies matter when every moment is observed. Looking back, the floral headpiece secret feels like a snapshot of optimism. A moment when Sarah believed she could adapt, prepare, and thrive within royal life. On that day, she seemed entirely at ease, smiling beneath flowers that carried not just beauty, but reassurance. It was a small act of control in an environment where control is often surrendered. As the monarchy moved forward, royal marriages would continue to reflect different approaches to balance, between tradition and individuality, duty and personality. Some couples would meet through chance encounters, others through shared passions that had nothing to do with titles or protocol. And nowhere is that contrast clearer than in the marriage of a princess who didn't meet her future husband in a palace drawing room at all, but in muddy fields, riding boots, and Olympic-level competition. 6. Princess Anne and Mark Phillips, 1973. When Princess Anne married Mark Phillips on November 14, 1973, their union stood apart from almost every royal marriage that came before it. There was no sweeping fairy tale narrative, no carefully curated romance designed to charm the public, and no sense that destiny had been orchestrated by palace advisors. Instead, this was a marriage rooted in shared grit, shared mud, and shared exhaustion, the kind that comes not from ceremony, but from competition. What made their relationship truly unusual was not how royal it was, but how unroyal it began. Anne and Mark did not meet at a grand ball or diplomatic reception. They met through horses. Both were elite equestrians, deeply serious about the sport and intensely competitive. Anne had been riding since childhood and was determined to be recognized for her skill rather than her title. Mark Phillips was a cavalry officer and professional horseman whose world revolved around training, discipline, and performance. In the stables and at competitions, Anne was not Her Royal Highness. She was simply another rider, mud-splattered, focused, and fiercely driven. Their bond grew not from romance in the traditional sense, but from mutual respect. Horses do not care about rank, and neither did Mark. Anne admired that. In his presence, she could exist without ceremony. They talked about training schedules, jumps, injuries, and performance rather than protocol. For Anne, who had spent her entire life under scrutiny, this equality was intoxicating. She was not being admired for her position, but for her ability. That equality extended into history-making territory. Anne and Mark remain the only royal couple in British history to have both competed in the Olympics. Mark won gold as part of the British equestrian team at the 1972 Munich Games. Anne competed at the 1976 Montreal Olympics, riding despite suffering a concussion earlier in the event. The image of a royal woman refusing to withdraw, determined to finish despite injury, captured Anne's character perfectly. She was relentless, stoic, and unapologetically tough. Their wedding reflected that practical mindset. Although held at Westminster Abbey and watched by millions, it lacked the emotional spectacle seen in other royal ceremonies. Anne wore a Tudor-style gown designed by Maureen Baker, elegant but restrained. There were no exaggerated flourishes, no theatrical displays of affection. Anne famously did not say "obey" in her vows, a first for a royal bride, and her demeanor throughout was calm, controlled, and businesslike. This was not a marriage built on illusion. It was built on shared schedules, shared exhaustion, and shared ambition. But those same qualities would later become sources of strain. Both Anne and Mark were intensely focused on their own pursuits. Mark was ambitious and independent. Anne fiercely dedicated to duty and work. Neither was inclined toward emotional expression or compromise. They functioned well as colleagues, but marriage demanded more than parallel lives. In many ways, their relationship mirrored a working partnership rather than a romantic one. They respected each other deeply, but they did not soften each other. Anne's famously blunt personality did not bend to domestic harmony, and Mark was not interested in adapting to royal expectations beyond what was absolutely necessary. Over time, the distance between them widened, not because of drama, but because of incompatibility. Yet even as the marriage eventually unraveled, their early story remains one of the most refreshing in royal history. It challenged the assumption that royals must marry within carefully curated social circles. It showed that shared passion could bridge gaps of status, at least temporarily, and it reinforced Anne's lifelong refusal to be defined solely by her title. The Olympic connection, in particular, cemented their legacy as a couple who existed beyond palace walls. Anne did not marry a prince, a foreign noble, or a political ally. She married someone who could outride her, outtrain her, and treat her as an equal. That choice alone marked her as one of the most unconventional royals of her generation. But as history would prove, unconventional beginnings do not guarantee enduring harmony. Over time, the same independence that drew them together pushed them apart. The marriage ended quietly, without spectacle, reflecting Anne's preference for privacy over performance. She moved forward with her life and work largely unchanged, proving that for her, marriage was never the defining chapter. As the monarchy approached the end of the 20th century, royal marriages began to shift again, this time toward deliberate normalcy. No grand rebellion, no dramatic symbolism, just quiet choices designed to reduce pressure and expectation. That evolution becomes strikingly clear in the next royal wedding, where even the guests were told to remove their hats and relax, whether tradition liked it or not. 7. Prince Edward and Sophie Rhys-Jones, 1999. When Prince Edward married Sophie Rhys-Jones on June 19, 1999, the wedding quietly signaled that royal marriages were entering a calmer, more self-aware phase. There was no attempt to recreate the spectacle of earlier decades, no insistence on overwhelming grandeur, and no illusion that tradition alone could carry the moment. Instead, Edward and Sophie approached their wedding with a clear goal: reduce pressure, lower expectations, and begin married life without the crushing weight of theatrical royal performance. The most telling expression of this mindset came in a request that would have seemed almost unthinkable in previous generations: a strict no-hats rule for guests. In British royal culture, hats are not just accessories. They are practically a language of hierarchy, tradition, and social signaling. Royal weddings are typically seas of elaborate headwear, each hat more dramatic than the last, competing silently for attention. Edward and Sophie deliberately rejected this visual arms race. Guests were asked to wear standard formal evening attire without hats, creating an atmosphere closer to a private celebration than a ceremonial pageant. It was an intentional step away from rigid formality, and it revealed how deeply the couple wanted their wedding to feel human rather than symbolic. The choice reflected Edward's personality perfectly. As the youngest son of Queen Elizabeth II, Edward had grown up watching his older siblings struggle under intense public pressure. He had seen how overwhelming spectacle could distort expectations and strain relationships. Unlike Charles or Andrew, Edward never appeared comfortable with the spotlight. His attempts at carving out a media career earlier in life had been met with mixed success, reinforcing his preference for working quietly behind the scenes. Sophie, a successful public relations executive, shared that instinct for control and discretion. She understood image, pressure, and perception, and how exhausting all three could be. Their relationship developed slowly and deliberately. Sophie was not swept into royal life overnight. She continued working after their engagement, maintaining her professional identity rather than immediately surrendering it. That balance was unusual at the time and foreshadowed how their marriage would function. Sophie was not seeking transformation, she was seeking partnership. The no-hats rule fit neatly into that philosophy. It was not rebellion, it was boundary setting. The wedding itself, held at St. George's Chapel in Windsor, felt noticeably different from grand cathedral ceremonies. The guest list was smaller, the tone was warmer. Sophie's dress, designed by Samantha Shaw, was elegant but understated, with no excessive ornamentation. Edward appeared relaxed, even relieved, as though the day aligned with who he actually was rather than who tradition demanded him to be. Their interactions were natural and affectionate, lacking the stiffness that had defined many royal weddings before them. Of course, not everyone complied. The Queen Mother, famously devoted to tradition, ignored the no-hats request and arrived wearing one anyway. Rather than causing tension, the moment became a gentle reminder of generational differences within the royal family. The couple did not react publicly. There was no enforcement, no embarrassment, just quiet acceptance. That response, too, reflected the nature of Edward and Sophie's approach. Firm boundaries, but no drama. The significance of the no-hats rule goes far beyond fashion. It symbolized a shift in how royal marriages were being framed. Instead of weddings designed to impress, Edward and Sophie prioritized comfort and sustainability. They wanted a beginning that felt manageable rather than overwhelming. In doing so, they created space for something rare in royal history, a marriage that would gradually strengthen rather than fracture under scrutiny. Their early years were not without challenges. Sophie's transition into royal life came with missteps and media scrutiny, particularly as she learned to navigate the boundaries between her former career and her new role. But unlike previous generations, mistakes did not define the marriage. Adjustments were made quietly. Lessons were learned. And over time, Edward and Sophie settled into a rhythm that emphasized duty, mutual support, and shared purpose. Today, their marriage is often cited as one of the most stable in the modern royal family. That stability did not come from spectacle or symbolism. It came from intention. The decision to remove hats from the equation seems trivial at first glance, but it encapsulated a broader philosophy. Strip away unnecessary performance, reduce competition, and allow people to simply exist as themselves. In hindsight, Edward and Sophie's wedding looks like a rehearsal for an even bolder shift to come. One where royal ceremonies would be simplified not just in dress code, but in scale, location, and structure. As public expectations continued to change, the monarchy would soon witness a marriage that went even further, abandoning cathedral grandeur entirely in favor of a quiet civil ceremony. And at its center would be a future king making one of the most controversial personal choices of his life. 8. King Charles III and Camilla Parker Bowles, 2005. When Charles, Prince of Wales, finally married Camilla Parker Bowles on April 9, 2005, it was not the triumphant royal spectacle many once imagined for a future king. There were no cathedral crowds lining the streets, no global broadcast from Westminster Abbey, and no attempt to frame the occasion as a fairy tale. Instead, the marriage took place in a modest civil ceremony at the Windsor Guildhall, followed by a religious blessing at St. George's Chapel. The most striking truth of all was not the scale of the event, but who was missing from the ceremony itself: the Queen. Queen Elizabeth II did not attend the actual marriage. For a monarchy built on symbolism, that absence spoke volumes. As Supreme Governor of the Church of England, the Queen felt she could not be present at a civil wedding involving two divorced people whose former spouses were still alive. The decision was not personal in tone, but constitutional and religious in nature. She chose instead to attend the blessing afterward and host a reception for the couple, an unmistakable compromise between duty and family loyalty. This careful separation perfectly captured the unusual position of Charles and Camilla's relationship. Their story stretched back decades, marked by timing, circumstance, and relentless public scrutiny. They had met in the early 1970s, long before Diana entered the picture, and formed a deep connection rooted in shared interests, humor, and temperament. Yet royal expectations, dynastic pressures, and social conventions pushed them apart. Charles married Diana, Camilla married Andrew Parker Bowles, and the relationship retreated into the shadows without ever fully disappearing. By the time Charles and Camilla married, the public knew their history intimately. There was no illusion left to preserve. This wedding was not about reinvention, it was about resolution. That honesty shaped every decision surrounding the event. The civil ceremony was small, attended by close family and friends. Camilla wore a pale cream ensemble rather than a traditional wedding gown, signaling maturity and realism rather than pageantry. Charles arrived without fanfare. The atmosphere was calm, restrained, and almost deliberately understated. The Queen's absence from the ceremony underscored the complexity of balancing personal happiness with institutional responsibility. It also highlighted how far the monarchy had evolved. Decades earlier, such a marriage might have been impossible. Now, it was permitted, but still navigated with caution. By attending the blessing and hosting the reception, the Queen made her position clear. The marriage was accepted, even if the path to it required careful boundaries. Public reaction reflected this nuance. There was no overwhelming jubilation, but there was also no widespread outrage. Many people viewed the wedding as long overdue, a quiet acknowledgement that life does not always unfold according to ideal scripts. Charles, now older and visibly more comfortable in Camilla's presence, appeared at ease in a way he rarely had before. Camilla, for her part, seemed grounded and unpretentious, deliberately avoiding any attempt to claim a spotlight she knew would provoke resistance. What made this marriage particularly significant was how it redefined royal optics. Instead of trying to recapture youthful romance, Charles and Camilla leaned into authenticity. Their ceremony acknowledged past mistakes without dwelling on them. It framed marriage not as a fantasy, but as companionship built over time. In doing so, it marked a turning point for the monarchy's relationship with reality. The religious blessing that followed the civil ceremony was rich with symbolism. Held in St. George's Chapel, it provided the spiritual recognition the civil ceremony could not. The Queen attended, visibly supportive, signaling institutional acceptance without compromising her role. The event allowed tradition and modernity to coexist, if not perfectly, then at least peacefully. In retrospect, the Queen's decision not to attend the marriage itself may have been the most honest gesture of all. It acknowledged that royal life is governed by principles larger than individual happiness, even as it made space for that happiness to exist. The marriage of Charles and Camilla was not a triumph over tradition, but a negotiation with it. Years later, as Charles ascended the throne and Camilla became queen consort, that wedding gained new meaning. What once seemed awkward and constrained now appears foundational. It established a precedent that even future kings must navigate personal choices within institutional limits, and that acceptance sometimes arrives in stages rather than all at once. As royal weddings moved further into the 21st century, another quiet but telling shift would occur, this time driven not by constitutional caution, but by global crisis. When a princess chose to marry during a pandemic, tradition would give way not to controversy, but to thrift, intimacy, and a surprising return to royal hand-me-downs. 9. Princess Beatrice and Edoardo Mapelli Mozzi, 2020. When Princess Beatrice married Edoardo Mapelli Mozzi on July 17, 2020, it was unlike any royal wedding that had come before it, and not by choice alone. The world was in the grip of a global pandemic. Public gatherings were restricted, travel was limited, and certainty was in short supply. Grand plans were scrapped, guest lists slashed, and spectacle replaced with caution. Yet out of those constraints emerged one of the most unexpectedly intimate and symbolically rich royal weddings of the modern era, defined by a decision that quietly stunned royal watchers. The bride wore a dress that was not new at all. Rather than commissioning a bespoke designer gown, Princess Beatrice turned to the Queen's wardrobe. She chose a vintage Norman Hartnell dress that Queen Elizabeth II had worn decades earlier, most famously to the London premiere of Lawrence of Arabia in 1962. The dress was carefully altered for Beatrice, with sleeves added and the silhouette adjusted, but its essence remained unmistakably royal history made wearable again. In an age obsessed with novelty and exclusivity, Beatrice chose inheritance. The choice was practical, symbolic, and deeply personal all at once. With lockdowns affecting designers and fittings, commissioning a new gown would have been difficult and potentially controversial. But beyond logistics, the dress carried meaning. Norman Hartnell was one of the Queen's most trusted designers, responsible for her wedding dress and coronation gown. By wearing Hartnell herself, Beatrice visually linked her marriage to the very foundations of her grandmother's reign. It was continuity stitched into fabric. The setting matched the sentiment. The ceremony took place at the Royal Chapel of All Saints in Windsor Great Park, not a cathedral or abbey, but a small private chapel. Attendance was limited to close family, including the Queen and Prince Philip, who had themselves married in austerity decades earlier. There were no crowds outside, no global broadcast, and no spectacle designed for cameras. The moment belonged to those present, and that restraint made it feel unusually sincere. Beatrice had long existed on the periphery of royal attention, often scrutinized but rarely celebrated. Her wedding, stripped of grandeur, allowed her to step forward not as a symbol, but as a person. The dress reinforced that shift. Rather than trying to redefine herself through fashion, she embraced history, family, and humility. The decision resonated strongly with the public, many of whom were themselves adapting to smaller, simpler milestones during an uncertain time. The symbolism extended beyond sentimentality. Re-wearing a royal dress also reflected changing attitudes toward sustainability and excess. Royal weddings have often been criticized for extravagance disconnected from public reality. Beatrice's choice, whether intentional or instinctive, aligned the monarchy with broader cultural shifts toward reuse and mindfulness. It suggested awareness, an understanding that symbolism matters, especially during hardship. The Queen's presence added emotional weight. At 94, she attended quietly, watching her granddaughter marry under circumstances that echoed her own early years of sacrifice. Prince Philip, nearing the end of his life, was also present. The image of the couple, married during rationing, witnessing a pandemic-era wedding framed by restraint and inheritance, created a powerful generational circle. Edoardo Mapelli Mozzi, a property developer with a calm, grounded demeanor, fit seamlessly into this atmosphere. He was not seeking transformation or spectacle. Their relationship had developed privately, without the prolonged public drama that had surrounded earlier royal romances. On the wedding day, there was no sense of performance, only intention. The photographs released afterward reinforced the tone. Soft lighting, minimal staging, and genuine smiles replaced grand backdrops. The dress, with its structured elegance and diamond accents, photographed beautifully, but it never overwhelmed the moment. It served as a bridge between eras rather than a statement of dominance. In retrospect, Princess Beatrice's wedding stands as one of the clearest examples of how constraint can produce meaning. What might have felt diminished instead felt distilled. By choosing a dress worn by the Queen herself, Beatrice didn't just borrow fabric, she borrowed history, resilience, and continuity. The wedding became less about status and more about belonging. As the royal family gradually emerged from the pandemic, ceremonies would return to larger scales and brighter spotlights. But the lessons of this wedding lingered. Tradition could be honored without excess. Meaning could be found in simplicity. And sometimes, the quietest royal weddings say the most. That contrast becomes especially interesting when we turn to the very next royal marriage, one that returned to Grand Windsor's spectacle, modern glamour, and global attention, yet carried its own quiet break from tradition in a place most people would never think to look: the groom's hand. 10. Princess Eugenie and Jack Brooksbank, 2018. When Princess Eugenie married Jack Brooksbank on October 12, 2018, the wedding appeared at first glance to be a return to full royal spectacle. Held at St. George's Chapel in Windsor, the ceremony featured a dramatic processional, a designer gown, and a guest list filled with aristocrats, celebrities, and royals. Yet tucked inside all that grandeur was a quiet, deeply personal decision that subtly challenged royal convention, one so understated that many viewers didn't notice it at all. The groom was not wearing a wedding ring. For centuries, royal weddings have been exercises in symbolism. Every accessory, every gesture, every item of clothing is scrutinized for meaning. Rings, in particular, are powerful symbols of unity, continuity, and permanence. Traditionally, brides wear rings. Grooms sometimes do, sometimes do not. In modern royal weddings, however, the trend had shifted toward matching bands. Prince William famously broke that pattern by choosing not to wear a ring when he married Catherine Middleton in 2011. Jack Brooksbank quietly followed that same path. Unlike many royal traditions, this one was not enforced by palace protocol. It was entirely Jack's choice. While Princess Eugenie received a beautiful Welsh gold ring, continuing a long-standing royal custom, Jack opted not to wear one at all. The decision was simple, practical, and personal. He had no desire for jewelry on his hands, preferring comfort and familiarity over symbolism. In a world where royal spouses are often expected to adopt ceremonial habits instantly, Jack's choice stood out as refreshingly unforced. This small detail reflected the nature of Eugenie and Jack's relationship. They had met years earlier through mutual friends, long before marriage was on the horizon. Jack was not raised within aristocratic circles, nor was he seeking to be reshaped by royal life. He had his own career in hospitality and business, working internationally and living largely outside palace walls. Eugenie, for her part, had carved out a professional identity in the art world, maintaining a sense of independence that distinguished her from earlier generations of royal women. Their wedding embodied that balance between tradition and individuality. Eugenie's dress, designed by Peter Pilato and Christopher DeVos, was elegant and modern, featuring a low back that deliberately revealed her surgical scar from childhood scoliosis treatment. This was not accidental. Eugenie wanted the scar visible as a message of confidence and acceptance, transforming what had once been a private vulnerability into a public statement of resilience. The gown was both regal and deeply personal, much like the marriage itself. Jack's decision not to wear a ring fit neatly into that same philosophy. It was not a rejection of marriage, but a refusal to perform symbolism for its own sake. Their relationship did not rely on outward signals to validate commitment. The ceremony itself, filled with warmth and genuine emotion, spoke louder than any accessory could. Eugenie and Jack exchanged smiles and glances that suggested familiarity rather than performance, ease rather than formality. Public reaction to the missing ring was muted but intrigued. Some observers noted the growing pattern among royal grooms choosing comfort over convention. Others saw it as another sign that modern royal marriages were increasingly shaped by personal preference rather than rigid expectation. In contrast to earlier eras, when every royal union served dynastic or political goals, this marriage felt unapologetically human. There was also something quietly symbolic about the timing of the wedding. Taking place in the same chapel where Prince Harry and Meghan Markle had married just months earlier, Eugenie and Jack's ceremony felt like part of a broader shift within the royal family. These younger royals were not dismantling tradition, but they were selectively reshaping it. They honored what mattered and discarded what didn't resonate personally. The absence of a ring on Jack's hand also highlighted an important truth about royal life. Adaptation goes both ways. While outsiders often assume that marrying into royalty requires total transformation, modern royal marriages increasingly reflect compromise. Eugenie did not demand that Jack conform entirely to palace customs. Jack did not resist the role entirely either. Instead, they met in the middle, creating a partnership that allowed space for individuality within institutional boundaries. In the years following their wedding, that balance has largely held. Eugenie and Jack have lived partly abroad, pursued careers outside strict royal duties, and maintained a relatively low-profile public presence. Their marriage has not been defined by symbolism, scandal, or spectacle, but by quiet continuity, something that feels increasingly rare in royal history. Looking back, the missing ring may seem insignificant, but in a family where even clothing buttons can carry meaning, such choices matter. They signal evolving priorities. They reveal where the institution loosens its grip and where individuals assert autonomy. Princess Eugenie and Jack Brooksbank's wedding marked another step toward a monarchy that allows marriages to look less like pageants and more like partnerships. And yet, this gradual loosening of tradition did not happen overnight. To understand where royal weddings first began to change in a truly revolutionary way, we must travel back to the 19th century, back to a young queen who redefined marriage itself by breaking protocol and asking a man to marry her. 11. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, 1840. When Queen Victoria married Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha on February 10, 1840, the event reshaped royal marriage forever, but not in the way most people expect. The lasting image is one of romance, devotion, and domestic harmony. Yet the most shocking and revealing truth about their union lies in its very beginning. Victoria had to propose to Albert herself. In a monarchy governed by rigid hierarchy and protocol, this reversal of roles was not romantic rebellion. It was constitutional necessity. Victoria was already queen when she fell in love with Albert. As the reigning monarch, she stood at the top of Britain's social and political order. No one, regardless of affection or intention, could formally propose marriage to her. Doing so would imply authority over the sovereign, something unthinkable in 19th century Britain. That meant the responsibility fell squarely on Victoria. If she wanted to marry, she had to initiate it. Her diary entries make the moment strikingly human. Victoria described summoning Albert to her private sitting room at Windsor Castle, her heart racing, her nerves taut. There was no dramatic kneeling, no theatrical speech. She simply asked him, directly, plainly, and with unmistakable vulnerability. Albert accepted immediately. What followed was not just a wedding, but a complete redefinition of royal marriage. At the time, royal unions were typically political arrangements, carefully engineered alliances designed to secure power, territory, or influence. Victoria's marriage disrupted that tradition. She chose Albert not for diplomatic advantage, but for personal compatibility. He was intelligent, disciplined, morally serious, and deeply supportive of her role. Their relationship quickly evolved into a partnership that blended affection with governance. The wedding itself was comparatively modest by royal standards. Held at the Chapel Royal in St. James's Palace, it was elegant but restrained. Victoria famously wore a white satin dress, helping to popularize white wedding gowns among brides across Europe, a trend that persists to this day. Yet beneath the visual legacy lay a more radical shift. This was a marriage centered on companionship rather than conquest. Albert's position after the wedding was complex. He was not king. He held no constitutional authority. Yet Victoria relied on him profoundly. He became her advisor, her confidant, and her stabilizing force. He reviewed state papers, assisted with speeches, and helped manage court life with methodical precision. Over time, Albert transformed the monarchy into a symbol of moral respectability, domestic stability, and disciplined family life, values that defined the Victorian era itself. But this dynamic also unsettled many observers. Some resented Albert's influence, seeing him as a foreigner exerting quiet control over British affairs. Others questioned whether Victoria, deeply devoted to her husband, was surrendering too much independence. In truth, their relationship was unusually balanced for its time. Victoria remained sovereign, but she welcomed partnership rather than isolation. The proposal itself became a powerful symbol in retrospect. It demonstrated that monarchy, for all its rigidity, could adapt to emotional reality. Victoria did not diminish herself by proposing. Instead, she exercised agency within constraint, bending protocol without breaking it. That act of personal choice would ripple outward, influencing how royal marriages were perceived for generations. Their devotion to each other was genuine and intense. Victoria was emotionally expressive, Albert more reserved, but their bond was undeniable. When Albert died prematurely in 1861, Victoria was devastated. Her prolonged mourning reshaped her public image and reinforced the idea that this marriage had been one of true emotional depth rather than ceremonial convenience. What makes this marriage so shocking is not that Victoria proposed, but what that proposal unleashed. It legitimized the idea that royal marriages could be built on love. It introduced the concept of partnership into an institution defined by hierarchy. And it set a precedent that future royals would either embrace or struggle against, depending on circumstance. In many ways, Queen Victoria and Prince Albert created the template modern royal couples still grapple with: how to balance duty and intimacy, symbolism and sincerity. Their marriage proved that personal connection could coexist with public responsibility, but not without tension. As royal history continued, that tension would manifest in very different ways. Sometimes love would be chosen first and duty adjusted afterward. Other times, tragedy would reshape plans entirely. And nowhere is that shift more poignant than in the next royal marriage, one born not from deliberate choice but from sudden loss, unexpected substitution, and a bride who found herself walking down the aisle beside the brother of the man she was originally meant to marry. 12. King George V and Mary of Teck, 1893. When Princess Mary of Teck married Prince George, Duke of York, on July 6, 1893, the ceremony looked perfectly conventional on the surface. There was no public scandal, no visible tension, and no suggestion that anything about the match was unusual. Yet behind the formal portraits and carefully rehearsed smiles lay one of the most emotionally complex royal marriages in British history, because Mary was not originally meant to marry George at all. She had been engaged to his elder brother. Mary's first fiancé was Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence, known within the family as Eddie. As the eldest son of the Prince of Wales, Eddie was the heir to the throne. Mary's engagement to him in 1891 was treated as a dynastic success, carefully arranged and publicly celebrated. She was already being prepared for life as a future queen. Then, just weeks later, everything collapsed. Eddie died suddenly during an influenza outbreak at the age of 28. The royal family was plunged into shock. A future king was gone. A carefully planned royal future vanished overnight. And Mary, young, dutiful, and deeply embedded in the expectations of monarchy, was left suspended in uncertainty. In an era when royal women were trained to adapt rather than resist, her personal grief was secondary to institutional necessity. What followed was extraordinary, even by royal standards. Within a year, Mary was engaged again, this time to Eddie's younger brother, Prince George. The logic was unmistakably practical. Mary was already acceptable to the family, already trained for royal life, already beloved by Queen Victoria. She understood duty, she understood sacrifice, and she understood the weight of continuity. Perhaps the most startling detail of all was how little was altered. Mary wore the same wedding dress material she had originally intended to use for her marriage to Eddie. The symbolism was stark. In many ways, the role mattered more than the individual man attached to it. She was not simply marrying George. She was continuing a destiny that had merely changed shape. To modern eyes, the arrangement can feel unsettling, but to Mary, it was an act of profound duty. She accepted the shift without public protest, embodying the stoicism that would later define her as Queen Mary. Over time, affection grew between her and George, but it was never a marriage fueled by romance. It was built instead on mutual respect, shared values, and an unshakable commitment to responsibility. George, who would later become King George V, was deeply different from his elder brother. Where Eddie had been perceived as charming but unfocused, George was disciplined, reserved, and deeply conscientious. He was shaped by naval service and valued order above all else. Mary, with her sharp intelligence and emotional restraint, matched him perfectly. Together, they formed a partnership that prized stability over sentiment. As king and queen, George and Mary would become the embodiment of royal seriousness. They modernized the monarchy not through innovation, but through consistency. They traveled widely, reinforced royal presence across the empire, and upheld an image of unwavering dignity during periods of enormous social change. Their marriage, though not passionate, was immensely functional, and that was precisely its strength. Mary never forgot her first engagement, but she did not dwell on it publicly. Instead, she redirected her energy into becoming the ideal royal consort. She was formidable, efficient, and deeply protective of the institution. In private, she was capable of warmth, but in public, she was unyielding. That composure helped carry the monarchy through World War I, a time when royal relevance was under intense scrutiny. The emotional cost of her early experience, however, lingered beneath the surface. Mary learned early that personal feelings must bend to institutional need. That lesson shaped not only her marriage, but her parenting. She raised her children with strict discipline, believing emotional restraint was a necessary survival skill for royalty. The consequences of that approach would ripple into the next generation, with mixed results. Looking back, the marriage of George V and Mary of Teck represents the monarchy at its most utilitarian. Love was secondary. Continuity was paramount. The institution did not pause for grief. It adapted, reassigned, and moved forward. Mary accepted that reality fully, becoming one of the most influential royal consorts in British history. And yet, this was also the last era in which such an arrangement could pass without serious public questioning. As the 20th century progressed, royal spouses would increasingly assert personal will, emotional needs, and private agency, sometimes with dramatic consequences. That shift becomes particularly vivid in the next royal marriage, where charm collided with impatience, affection clashed with habit, and a future king found himself regularly waiting, because his bride enjoyed reminding him that not even royalty could control her time. 13. King Edward VII and Alexandra of Denmark, 1863. When Albert Edward, Prince of Wales, later King Edward VII, married Princess Alexandra of Denmark on March 10, 1863, the match seemed ideal on paper. He was the heir to the British throne. She was young, beautiful, and instantly adored by the public. Their wedding at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, was celebrated with enormous enthusiasm, ushering in a rare moment of optimism during Queen Victoria's long and somber reign. Yet behind the smiling portraits and glittering receptions lay a marriage defined by contrast, especially in temperament. And nowhere was that contrast more playfully and pointedly expressed than in Alexandra's habit of arriving late on purpose. Edward was famously obsessed with punctuality. He believed timeliness reflected discipline, respect, and authority. Appointments mattered. Schedules mattered. Waiting was, to him, an irritation bordering on insult. Alexandra knew this very well. And she also knew something else just as important. As his wife, she was one of the very few people in the world who could ignore his impatience without consequence. So she did. Alexandra developed a quiet habit of dressing slowly, lingering deliberately, and arriving fashionably and intentionally late. She enjoyed making Edward wait, not out of cruelty or rebellion, but as a gentle assertion of independence within a marriage where power otherwise tilted heavily in one direction. It became a kind of private joke, a small act of defiance wrapped in charm. Courtiers noticed. Edward fumed. Alexandra smiled serenely. To understand why this mattered, it helps to understand who they were. Edward was exuberant, sociable, indulgent, and endlessly curious about pleasure and company. He loved dinners, conversations, and being surrounded by people. Alexandra, by contrast, was reserved, gentle, and emotionally private. She disliked confrontation and avoided public conflict, preferring quiet forms of self-expression. Her lateness was one of them. Their marriage was affectionate in public but complicated in reality. Edward's extramarital relationships were widely known, and Alexandra, while deeply hurt, chose not to challenge him openly. Instead, she withdrew emotionally and created boundaries where she could. The lateness became symbolic of that withdrawal, a reminder that while Edward might dominate public life, he did not control her entirely. Ironically, Alexandra's popularity with the public far exceeded Edward's for much of their early married life. She was celebrated for her beauty, kindness, and composure. Even as she suffered from increasing hearing loss later in life, she maintained a graceful presence that endeared her to the nation. Edward, meanwhile, was often criticized as frivolous and irresponsible during his years as Prince of Wales. This imbalance likely fueled Alexandra's quiet assertiveness. She had little interest in political influence or public power, but she valued personal dignity deeply. Making Edward wait was not just teasing. It was a way of preserving a sense of agency in a marriage where emotional equality was difficult to achieve. Their wedding itself had already hinted at these dynamics. Edward was exuberant, almost impatient to begin married life. Alexandra appeared calm, composed, and almost detached. From the beginning, they inhabited different emotional rhythms. Over time, those differences hardened into routine. Edward sought stimulation elsewhere. Alexandra built a private world centered on her children, charities, and close companions. Yet despite these tensions, their marriage endured for decades. They did not separate. They did not publicly quarrel. They performed their roles with consistency, if not intimacy. Alexandra remained loyal in duty, if not in emotional closeness. Edward, for all his wandering attention, respected her position and never attempted to diminish her public standing. The lateness habit, trivial as it seems, captured the essence of their relationship. Alexandra did not confront Edward directly. She did not demand change. Instead, she carved out small spaces of control where she could, subtle, dignified, and unmistakably intentional. It was a strategy shaped by constraint rather than rebellion. When Edward finally ascended the throne in 1901 after Queen Victoria's death, Alexandra became queen consort almost overnight. Her popularity soared. Edward, now king, mellowed with age but never lost his impatience. Alexandra never lost her habit. Even as queen, she occasionally arrived after the appointed hour, serene and unbothered, reminding the court that time, like power, could bend in unexpected ways. In retrospect, their marriage represents a transitional moment in royal history. It was no longer purely dynastic, but not yet emotionally modern. Personal fulfillment and personal frustration coexisted quietly, managed through habit rather than confrontation. Alexandra's lateness was not a flaw. It was a language, spoken softly in a world that rarely allowed royal women to speak at all. And as royal marriages moved deeper into the 20th century, that tension between duty and personal desire would grow sharper, more explicit, and far harder to manage. In the next royal union, hesitation would give way not to quiet habits, but to outright resistance, because the woman at its center would say no, not once, not twice, but 3 times before agreeing to become a royal bride. 14. King George VI and Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, 1923. When Prince Albert, Duke of York, later King George VI, married Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon on April 26, 1923, the ceremony at Westminster Abbey appeared gentle, traditional, and reassuring. The bride smiled warmly, the groom looked earnest, and the public embraced the match as a comforting symbol of stability after the upheaval of World War I. Yet behind this seemingly serene union lay a truth that startled even royal insiders. Elizabeth had rejected Albert's proposal not once, not twice, but 3 times. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon was not born into royalty. She came from a prominent aristocratic family, but she had grown up with a strong sense of personal freedom and emotional independence. She enjoyed country life, family warmth, and social ease. qualities that did not align naturally with the rigid expectations of royal existence. When Albert first proposed in 1921, Elizabeth declined politely but firmly. She liked him. She respected him. But she did not want the life that came with the title. Her hesitation was not theatrical or manipulative. It was deeply sincere. Elizabeth understood what royal marriage demanded: public exposure, constant scrutiny, loss of privacy, and a lifetime shaped by duty rather than choice. She reportedly described the prospect as being like a bird in a gilded cage, admired but constrained. At a time when women of her class were only beginning to assert personal agency, Elizabeth's refusal was quietly radical. Albert, meanwhile, was deeply in love, and deeply insecure. Shy, anxious, and struggling with a stammer that made public appearances agonizing, he found in Elizabeth a sense of calm and acceptance he had never experienced before. Her warmth and humor put him at ease. Losing her felt unthinkable. Yet rather than pressure her with status or expectation, Albert accepted her refusals with patience, returning each time with renewed sincerity. The third rejection cut especially deep. By then, Albert was convinced he would never marry anyone else. He reportedly told Elizabeth that if she refused again, he would remain single for life. There was no melodrama, no public declaration, just a quiet, devastating honesty. It was this moment, more than any other, that changed Elizabeth's mind. She realized that this was not a man seeking a consort for ambition or convenience, but a partner seeking emotional refuge. When Elizabeth finally accepted, it was not because the royal life had become more appealing. It was because she believed she could make a difference, specifically to Albert. Their marriage was not built on romance alone, but on mutual support. Elizabeth brought lightness and resilience. Albert brought loyalty and devotion. Together, they formed a partnership stronger than either could manage alone. The wedding itself reflected this emotional foundation. Elizabeth broke tradition by placing her bouquet on the tomb of the unknown warrior, a gesture of remembrance and humility that resonated deeply with a nation still mourning wartime loss. The act was spontaneous, personal, and profoundly symbolic, much like the marriage itself. It signaled that this royal union would be grounded in empathy rather than display. Their early married life reinforced that promise. Elizabeth became Albert's anchor, helping him manage his anxieties and public responsibilities. She encouraged him, protected him, and believed in him long before the world did. When fate intervened in 1936 and Albert unexpectedly became king after his brother's abdication, Elizabeth's role became even more crucial. The shy man who had never wanted the throne now faced it head-on, supported by the woman who had once feared royal life most of all. As queen consort, Elizabeth transformed public perception of the monarchy. She was approachable, warm, and emotionally expressive in ways that resonated with ordinary people. During World War II, she refused to leave London during bombing raids, famously stating that she could now look the East End in the face. Her courage cemented her place in national memory, but it was forged in the private decisions she had made years earlier. The irony of her story is impossible to miss. The woman who resisted becoming royal would become one of the most beloved queens in British history. Her initial refusals did not weaken the monarchy, they strengthened it. By choosing marriage only when she was emotionally ready, Elizabeth ensured that the partnership she entered was resilient enough to withstand extraordinary pressure. Albert, for his part, never forgot her hesitation. It made him cherish her more deeply, aware that her presence was a choice, not an obligation. Their marriage endured not because it was easy, but because it was honest. It was built on consent, patience, and mutual need, qualities that royal unions had not always prioritized. Yet even as this marriage stabilized the monarchy, the very next royal union would do the opposite. Where Albert pleaded and waited, his elder brother would defy convention entirely. Where Elizabeth hesitated out of caution, another woman would be blamed for chaos. And where one king found strength through partnership, another would abandon the throne altogether, setting the stage for the most controversial royal marriage of the 20th century. 15. King Edward VIII and Wallis Simpson, 1937. When King Edward VIII married Wallis Simpson on June 3, 1937, the ceremony itself was almost shockingly quiet for an event that had already detonated a constitutional crisis. There were no cheering crowds, no cathedral bells, and no royal relatives in attendance. By the time Edward stood beside Wallis at the Château de Candé in France, he was no longer king. He had abdicated the throne for her, becoming the Duke of Windsor, and in doing so had permanently altered the course of the British monarchy. Yet the most revealing detail of the marriage was not the abdication itself, it was what Wallis wore. Wallis Simpson did not wear white. Instead, she chose a pale blue dress designed by Mainbacher, a color so carefully calibrated that it came to be known simply as Wallis blue. The shade was custom dyed to match her eyes, cool and elegant rather than bridal or innocent. The choice was deliberate, modern, and unmistakably symbolic. This was her third marriage. She was not attempting to present herself as a fairy tale bride. She was presenting herself exactly as she was. In royal tradition, white had long symbolized purity, continuity, and idealized beginnings. Wallis rejected all of that. Her dress acknowledged reality rather than myth. It reflected the truth of her life and the unconventional path that had led her there. In doing so, it unsettled many observers far more than a white gown ever could have. This was not a woman stepping quietly into royal expectation. This was a woman unapologetically redefining it. The dress itself became legendary. Clean-lined, perfectly tailored, and devoid of excess, it embodied Wallis's famously precise sense of style. There were no frills, no lace, no romantic flourishes. Even her accessories were restrained. She understood the power of minimalism and used it ruthlessly. In photographs, she appears composed, controlled, and entirely unrepentant. Over time, however, the dress acquired an unexpected afterlife. The dye used to create Wallis blue was chemically unstable. As decades passed, the fabric began to change color. What was once pale blue gradually shifted into a strange beige-brown hue. Today, when displayed in museums, the dress no longer resembles the image burned into public memory. The transformation has fascinated historians and curators alike, turning the gown into an accidental metaphor. Just as the color faded and altered, so too did the romantic narrative Edward had clung to. The marriage that cost him a crown did not deliver the untroubled happiness he had imagined. Edward remained resentful toward the royal family and Britain itself, believing he had been treated unjustly. Wallis, meanwhile, lived under constant scrutiny, blamed for the abdication, and excluded from full royal acceptance. She never received the title of Her Royal Highness, a slight that deeply wounded Edward and hardened his bitterness. Their life together unfolded, largely in exile, moving between France and the United States, hosting glittering social gatherings while remaining fundamentally outside the institution Edward once ruled. The marriage was intense, insular, and emotionally dependent. Edward adored Wallis to the point of self-erasure. Wallis, in turn, struggled with the burden of being the justification for abdication, a role she neither sought nor escaped. The wedding itself, stripped of royal endorsement, reflected that isolation. No members of Edward's immediate family attended. The Archbishop of Canterbury refused to officiate. The Church of England did not sanction the marriage. In many ways, it was less a royal wedding than a personal declaration staged in defiance of everything Edward had been raised to protect. And yet, for all the controversy, the marriage forced the monarchy to confront uncomfortable truths. It exposed the limits of personal desire within constitutional duty. It demonstrated that the crown was larger than any individual, even a king. Edward's abdication allowed his brother, George VI, to ascend the throne, ultimately strengthening the monarchy through resilience rather than romance. Wallis's blue dress, then, stands as more than a fashion choice. It represents defiance, realism, and consequence. It rejected illusion in favor of clarity. It acknowledged that this marriage was not a beginning, but a culmination of choices that could not be undone. The dress faded, the romance complicated, and the fairy tale dissolved. But the impact endured. In retrospect, Edward and Wallis's marriage marks the end of one era and the beginning of another. After them, royal marriages could never again pretend that personal happiness existed separately from public responsibility. Every union would be measured against this moment, this sacrifice, this exile, this blue dress that refused to pretend otherwise. And yet, as dramatic as this chapter was, it was not the most dysfunctional royal marriage in British history. Long before abdication and exile, another king entered a union so disastrous that it collapsed almost immediately, marked not by quiet rebellion or symbolic color, but by open contempt, public humiliation, and a wedding day that shocked even hardened courtiers. 16. King George IV and Caroline of Brunswick, 1795. When George, Prince of Wales, later King George IV, married Caroline of Brunswick on April 8, 1795, the union was doomed almost from its first breath. This was not a marriage strained by time or circumstance. It was one that collapsed on contact. The shocking truth is not merely that the couple disliked each other, but that the groom arrived at the altar visibly intoxicated, so impaired that he reportedly had to be physically supported through the ceremony. In the rigid, image-obsessed world of Georgian royalty, the scene was nothing short of scandalous. The background to the wedding explains much of its dysfunction. George was deeply in debt, drowning in extravagant spending that Parliament refused to bail out unless he married and produced a legitimate heir. Caroline, a German princess he had never met, was selected as a solution to a financial problem, not as a partner. George, already emotionally attached to Maria Fitzherbert, a Catholic widow he considered his true wife, resented the arrangement intensely. From the start, this marriage represented coercion rather than choice. Their first meeting was catastrophic. George found Caroline unrefined, loud, and socially awkward. Caroline, in turn, was unimpressed by George's appearance and demeanor. There was no attempt to conceal the mutual disgust. On the night they met, George reportedly asked for alcohol almost immediately, a habit that would become emblematic of his approach to the marriage. By the time the wedding day arrived, his resistance had hardened into open contempt. During the ceremony at the Chapel Royal in St. James's Palace, George was visibly unsteady. Observers noted his glassy eyes, slurred speech, and lack of composure. Two dukes were said to be positioned nearby to keep him upright. The symbolism was brutal, a future king so unwilling to participate in his own marriage that he dulled himself to get through it. Caroline, inexperienced and hopeful despite the tension, was left to endure the humiliation in full view of the court. The marriage deteriorated immediately. The couple spent almost no time together after the ceremony. George avoided Caroline whenever possible, retreating into separate residences and refusing even basic marital courtesy. Caroline, isolated and confused, struggled to navigate English court life without support from her husband. Their relationship became a battleground of public accusations, surveillance, and mutual hostility. Despite the animosity, one critical outcome occurred. Caroline gave birth to Princess Charlotte in 1796. The child was celebrated as a future hope for the monarchy, but even this could not stabilize the marriage. George showed little interest in either his wife or daughter, while Caroline clung to Charlotte as her sole source of affection and purpose. When George later restricted Caroline's access to her child, the conflict escalated dramatically. What makes this marriage particularly shocking is how openly it collapsed. Royal dysfunction is often hidden behind ceremony and discretion, but George and Caroline's hostility spilled into public life. Accusations flew, investigations were launched. Caroline's behavior was scrutinized relentlessly, while George leveraged his power to isolate and discredit her. The public, increasingly aware of George's excesses and cruelty, largely sided with Caroline, turning her into an unlikely symbol of resistance. When George eventually became king in 1820, the situation reached its bitter climax. He attempted to prevent Caroline from being crowned as queen consort. On Coronation Day, Caroline was physically barred from entering Westminster Abbey. The image of a crowned king excluding his own wife from the ceremony shocked the nation and cemented George IV's reputation as vindictive and self-indulgent. Looking back, the drunken wedding becomes more than a scandalous anecdote. It was a preview. It revealed a man who treated duty as an inconvenience, marriage as a transaction, and public image as something to be managed through force rather than responsibility. Caroline, for all her flaws, became a casualty of an institution willing to sacrifice individual dignity to preserve control. This marriage stands as one of the most toxic in British royal history, not because it involved secret affairs or whispered resentment, but because its failure was immediate, public, and relentless. There was no honeymoon period, no gradual unraveling. From the moment George staggered through the vows, the marriage existed only on paper. And yet, as disastrous as this union was, it was not unique in royal history. Centuries earlier, another king entered a marriage he found unbearable, one that collapsed not after years of conflict, but almost instantly. In that case, the king's disappointment was so extreme that it reshaped the fate of his bride forever, setting the stage for one of the strangest and most revealing royal separations of all time. 17. King Henry VIII and Anne of Cleves, 1540. When King Henry VIII married Anne of Cleves on January 6, 1540, the union barely qualified as a marriage in any meaningful sense. It was over almost as soon as it began, unraveling with such speed and awkwardness that even by Tudor standards it stood out as uniquely disastrous. The shocking truth is not just that Henry disliked his new queen, but that the marriage collapsed because the king claimed he simply could not bring himself to be attracted to her, blaming everything from her appearance to her supposed personal habits. Within 6 months, Anne of Cleves would be divorced, demoted, and quietly repurposed into something far safer, the king's beloved sister. The roots of the disaster lay in distance and diplomacy. Anne was a German noblewoman chosen not for romance, but for politics. England needed Protestant allies in Europe, and Anne's brother ruled the powerful Duchy of Cleves. Henry agreed to the match without meeting her, relying instead on a flattering portrait painted by Hans Holbein. The image showed a composed, refined woman of quiet dignity, exactly the kind of queen Henry believed would suit him. The reality, at least in Henry's eyes, was devastating. When Anne arrived in England, Henry decided to surprise her by visiting in disguise, a courtly gesture he believed would charm her. Anne, unfamiliar with English customs and unaware that the stranger before her was the king himself, reacted politely but without enthusiasm. Henry was humiliated. From that moment on, his disappointment hardened into resentment. He complained bitterly to courtiers that the woman in front of him did not resemble her portrait closely enough and lacked the qualities he expected in a queen. Henry's reaction was immediate and dramatic. He reportedly declared that he felt no desire to consummate the marriage and later claimed that Anne had an unpleasant personal presence, language vague enough to scandalize without specifying details. Whether these complaints were exaggerated excuses or genuine disappointment remains debated, but the outcome was clear. Henry wanted out, and quickly. Anne, for her part, was bewildered. She had been raised in a conservative household with little exposure to the theatrical court culture Henry adored. Her manners were reserved, her education practical rather than artistic. What Henry interpreted as dullness was, in reality, cultural difference. But in Tudor England, perception mattered more than fairness, especially when a king's pride was bruised. The wedding itself was tense and joyless. Observers noted Henry's visible lack of enthusiasm. Anne behaved with dignity, unaware that her position was already precarious. Behind the scenes, Henry was instructing advisors, to find a way to dissolve the marriage without triggering international fallout. The solution came swiftly. The marriage would be annulled on the grounds that it had never been consummated and that Anne had previously been engaged, rendering the union invalid. Anne's response to the annulment was remarkable and strategic. Rather than resist or protest, she agreed calmly. She accepted Henry's decision, acknowledged him as her good brother, and cooperated fully with the legal process. In return, she received an extraordinarily generous settlement, multiple estates, financial security, and a permanent place at court. She would live comfortably in England for the rest of her life, outlasting Henry and all his other wives. This outcome is what truly makes the story shocking. Anne of Cleves is often remembered as the wife Henry rejected, but she may have been the one who emerged safest. She avoided imprisonment, disgrace, and execution. She retained independence, wealth, and dignity. In a court where survival often depended on obedience rather than affection, Anne mastered the art of quiet adaptation. Henry, meanwhile, treated the marriage as an embarrassment to be erased. He blamed advisors, mocked the portrait, and quickly moved on to his next infatuation. The speed with which he discarded Anne exposed how little personal connection mattered in his pursuit of control and image. Marriage for Henry was not a bond, it was a tool, and when it failed to satisfy his expectations, he abandoned it without hesitation. The public narrative that Anne was undesirable or inadequate has lingered for centuries, but modern historians increasingly question it. Contemporary accounts describe her as dignified and kind, if reserved. The true issue was compatibility, not only personal, but cultural. Henry wanted admiration, excitement, and theatrical devotion. Anne offered steadiness, restraint, and humility. In another life, those qualities might have been valued. In Henry's court, they were liabilities. The irony is sharp. The king who complained so loudly about Anne's suitability would later recognize her as one of the few people he genuinely trusted. She was welcomed at court functions, treated with respect, and referred to affectionately. Their relationship worked only once it stopped being a marriage. The marriage to Anne of Cleves stands as one of the clearest examples of how royal unions could be undone not by scandal or betrayal, but by wounded ego and unmet fantasy. It was a reminder that power allows disappointment to become policy, and that survival sometimes depends not on resistance, but on knowing when to step aside. And yet, even this strange and bloodless ending pales in comparison to the marriage that came immediately before it. Because just years earlier, Henry VIII had pursued another woman with such obsession that he broke with Rome itself to have her, and secretly bound himself to her long before any public ceremony ever took place. 18. King Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, 1533. When King Henry VIII married Anne Boleyn, the union was already steeped in secrecy, defiance, and urgency long before any public ceremony took place. The shocking truth is that Henry and Anne were almost certainly married in private months before their official wedding was announced. This was not romance for romance's sake. It was a calculated act driven by obsession, desperation, and fear of consequences. By the time the court celebrated their marriage publicly, the most important part had already happened behind closed doors. Henry's pursuit of Anne Boleyn was unlike anything he had experienced before. Unlike previous women at court, Anne refused to become his mistress. She was intelligent, sharp-tongued, and acutely aware of her value. Rather than submitting to the king's advances, she withheld intimacy and insisted on legitimacy. This refusal transformed Henry's interest into fixation. He convinced himself that Anne was not merely desirable, but essential, both emotionally and dynastically. At the heart of the matter was succession. Henry was desperate for a male heir, and his marriage to Catherine of Aragon had failed to produce one who survived infancy. Anne represented hope, renewal, and control over his future legacy. But there was a problem. Catherine was still alive, and the Pope refused to grant an annulment. What followed was one of the most dramatic breaks in European history. Henry severed ties with the Roman Catholic Church, declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, and rewrote centuries of religious authority, all to clear the path to Anne. Yet even after this monumental upheaval, Henry was not willing to wait. Evidence suggests that Henry and Anne secretly exchanged vows sometime in late 1532 or early 1533, before any public wedding took place. The reason was simple and urgent. Anne was pregnant. Any child born before marriage would face questions of legitimacy, and Henry could not risk undermining the very succession he had upended his kingdom to secure. A private ceremony ensured that, in Henry's eyes at least, the child would be lawful. The official wedding, held in January 1533, was therefore less a beginning than a confirmation. By the time Anne was crowned queen in a lavish ceremony months later, her fate was already tied irrevocably to the success of her pregnancy. The pressure was immense. Anne was no longer just a wife. She was the embodiment of Henry's gamble. If she failed to produce a male heir, everything he had destroyed and rebuilt would stand on shaky ground. Ironically, Anne did give birth, but not to the son Henry expected. In September 1533, she delivered a healthy daughter, Elizabeth. While Henry initially masked his disappointment, it was impossible to ignore. Anne's position weakened almost immediately. The intensity that had once fueled Henry's devotion cooled into impatience. The same qualities that had attracted him, Anne's sharp intellect, her refusal to submit easily, began to irritate him. The marriage itself was volatile. Anne and Henry argued openly. She challenged him in ways no previous queen had dared. She involved herself in court politics, made enemies, and lacked the diplomatic patience that survival in Tudor England demanded. Henry, increasingly distracted and already looking elsewhere, grew distant. The secret vows that had once protected Anne now meant nothing. Power, not promises, ruled Henry's world. What makes this marriage especially shocking is how quickly secrecy turned into disposability. Anne had been the reason England broke from Rome. She had been the woman Henry waited years to marry. And yet, within 3 years, she was removed from her position entirely. The private vows, the public coronation, the sacrifices made in her name, none of it saved her once Henry decided she was no longer useful. Elizabeth, the daughter whose legitimacy Henry had been so desperate to protect, would later become one of England's greatest monarchs. But at the time, her birth was seen as a failure. Anne's inability to deliver a son sealed her fate in Henry's eyes. The marriage that began in secrecy ended in silence, erasure, and a swift rewriting of history. In retrospect, the secret marriage reveals Henry VIII at his most revealing. He was willing to bend law, religion, and custom to satisfy desire and secure power. But once those goals shifted, loyalty vanished. Anne believed marriage would protect her. In reality, it bound her more tightly to Henry's expectations. And when she failed to meet them, the bond became a liability rather than a shield. The tragedy of Henry and Anne's marriage lies not only in its ending, but in its illusion. Anne believed legitimacy would grant security. Henry believed control would guarantee satisfaction. Both were wrong. The secret vows that once seemed urgent and meaningful became irrelevant the moment Henry's attention moved on. And yet, even this deeply personal catastrophe would echo far beyond the couple themselves. Because the religious rupture Henry created to marry Anne did not vanish with her fall. It reshaped England permanently, altering royal marriage, succession, and power for generations to come. Those consequences become even clearer when we move forward to another royal marriage, driven not by passion, but by politics. One where affection was measured, negotiated, and questioned in writing, and where a queen found herself married to a man who openly asked advisors how much courtesy he was legally required to show her. 19. Queen Mary, I and Philip of Spain, 1554. When Queen Mary married Philip of Spain on July 25, 1554, the ceremony was steeped in caution rather than celebration. This was not a union born of romance or shared temperament. but a carefully negotiated political alliance designed to strengthen Catholic power in Europe. The shocking truth is not merely that the marriage lacked warmth, but that Philip, before the wedding even took place, felt compelled to ask his advisors how polite he was legally required to be toward his wife in public. For a reigning queen marrying a foreign prince, the imbalance was stark and painfully revealing. Mary was England's first queen regnant to rule in her own right, a position that made her both powerful and vulnerable. At 37, she was older than most royal brides of the era and deeply conscious of her duty to secure the succession. Philip, by contrast, was 11 years younger, already experienced in dynastic politics, and far more interested in what the marriage could offer strategically than emotionally. From the beginning, the match was unequal, not in status, but in investment. Philip arrived in England speaking little English and harboring few illusions about affection. Contemporary accounts describe his discomfort with Mary's appearance and manner, but more important than attraction was calculation. Philip's advisors were clear. He must not appear overly devoted, lest he undermine his own authority or appear subordinate to a woman who ruled a foreign kingdom. At the same time, he could not appear cold, as public perception mattered. Hence his question: how much courtesy, how much visible affection was expected of him by law? That question alone exposes the emotional vacuum at the heart of the marriage. Courtesy became a legal threshold rather than a natural impulse. Philip did not need to love Mary. He needed only to perform respect convincingly enough to maintain stability. The marriage contract itself reflected this detachment. It carefully limited Philip's power in England, ensuring he would not rule independently, appoint foreigners to office, or drag England into Spain's wars without consent. In effect, Philip was Mary's husband, but not her king. Mary, however, approached the marriage with sincere hope. She had endured a lonely childhood marked by instability, displacement, and emotional deprivation. For her, marriage represented companionship, legitimacy, and the promise of heirs. She was deeply invested in the idea that Philip would become both partner and protector. The reality was far colder. Philip spent as little time in England as possible, departing whenever political obligations allowed. When present, he was courteous but distant, fulfilling obligations rather than forming bonds. Public reaction to the marriage was tense from the start. Many English subjects feared domination by Spain and resented the idea of a foreign consort. Rebellions broke out even before the wedding took place. Mary, already struggling to assert authority as a female monarch, now found herself defending a marriage that brought her little personal comfort and considerable political strain. Perhaps the most painful aspect of the union involved Mary's desperate hope for a child. She experienced what were believed at the time to be pregnancies, announced with confidence, prepared for with ceremony, but no child ever came. Each disappointment weakened her position further. Philip, meanwhile, showed little visible concern. His interest in England waned as his responsibilities elsewhere grew, and he increasingly treated the marriage as a diplomatic footnote rather than a shared life. Despite this, Mary remained devoted. She wrote to Philip with affection and longing, pleading for his presence and reassurance. He responded politely, formally, and sparingly. The imbalance between her emotional commitment and his strategic detachment became painfully obvious to those at court. When Philip left England for extended periods, Mary governed alone, increasingly isolated and physically unwell. The tragedy of their marriage lies not in open cruelty, but in indifference. Philip was not overtly unkind. He was simply absent, in body, in affection, and in intention. Mary, for all her authority, found herself bound to a man who viewed the marriage as a means to an end. When she died in 1558, childless and disappointed, Philip did not return for her funeral. Within months, he proposed marriage to her successor, Elizabeth I, a move that underscored how little the union had meant to him personally. In hindsight, Mary and Philip's marriage stands as a stark example of how royal unions could strip individuals of dignity under the guise of duty. Mary sought validation, continuity, and partnership. Philip sought advantage, restraint, and distance. The marriage delivered exactly what he wanted, and almost nothing of what she needed. Yet the legacy of this union did not end with Mary's death. It influenced how England viewed foreign marriages, how queens navigated authority, and how affection and performance were weighed against political necessity. The lesson was clear. Marriages built solely on strategy rarely produce stability, and emotional neglect can be as damaging as open conflict. That lesson would echo into later centuries, when another royal bride arrived from abroad carrying unfamiliar customs, and found herself bewildered by English habits she did not understand. In that marriage, confusion would replace calculation. Politeness would give way to misunderstanding, and something as simple as a request for tea would expose how wide the cultural gap between husband and wife truly was. 20. King Charles II and Catherine of Braganza, 1662. When King Charles II married Catherine of Braganza on May 21, 1662, the match was meant to be a triumph of restoration and diplomacy. Charles had only recently reclaimed the throne after years of exile, and England was eager to project stability, legitimacy, and renewed confidence. Catherine, a Portuguese princess, arrived bearing one of the most valuable dowries in British history, including the ports of Tangier and Bombay. On paper, it was a spectacular alliance. In reality, the marriage revealed how fragile cultural understanding could be, even at the highest level of power. And the most unexpectedly revealing moment came not from politics or scandal, but from a simple request for tea. Catherine had grown up in Portugal, where tea was already a familiar and refined beverage among the upper classes. In England, however, tea was still an exotic curiosity, known only in small quantities and often misunderstood. On her arrival at court, Catherine reportedly asked for a cup of tea, expecting comfort, familiarity, perhaps even a small reminder of home. Instead, the English courtiers, unsure how to respond and lacking tea altogether, offered her a tankard of ale. Catherine was reportedly horrified. This moment, trivial on the surface, perfectly encapsulated the deeper mismatch at the heart of the marriage. Catherine was shy, devoutly Catholic, and accustomed to a quieter, more restrained court culture. Charles II was exuberant, social, and famously indulgent, presiding over a court known for its wit, excess, and informality. Where Catherine sought comfort and familiarity, Charles thrived on novelty and stimulation. From the very beginning, they were speaking different emotional and cultural languages. Charles married Catherine for strategic reasons, not romantic ones. He needed her dowry to stabilize England's finances and strengthen its global position. Catherine, for her part, approached the marriage with sincere hope. She admired Charles and believed marriage would bring companionship and purpose. Instead, she found herself isolated in a court that viewed her religion with suspicion and her personality with impatience. Tea, ironically, would eventually become Catherine's most enduring legacy. Though initially misunderstood, her preference for it gradually influenced English court habits. Over time, tea gained popularity, eventually becoming a defining feature of British culture. What began as a moment of confusion evolved into quiet transformation, an unintended cultural export that outlived the marriage's emotional failures. Catherine's challenges extended far beyond beverages. She struggled with the English language, unfamiliar customs, and a court that made little effort to accommodate her. Charles, meanwhile, made no attempt to hide his ongoing relationships with other women. His court was filled with mistresses who wielded influence, charm, and confidence, qualities Catherine lacked and could not easily develop in such an environment. Perhaps most painful was Catherine's inability to produce an heir. Despite multiple pregnancies that ended in loss, she never bore a surviving child. In a monarchy desperate for stability, this failure weakened her position further. Charles, while affectionate toward Catherine in a formal sense, did not change his behavior or priorities. He acknowledged numerous children born outside the marriage and showed them public favor, a constant reminder of Catherine's vulnerability. Yet despite everything, Catherine remained loyal. She did not publicly challenge Charles, nor did she retreat entirely into bitterness. She focused on religious devotion, charity, and quiet dignity. When political tides turned against Catholics later in Charles's reign, Catherine became a target of suspicion and rumor. Charles, to his credit, defended her publicly and refused to divorce her, even when doing so might have served his interests. In that sense, their marriage contained a strange contradiction: emotional distance paired with institutional loyalty. The tea incident, often retold as amusing trivia, reflects something deeper than cultural misunderstanding. It reveals how little effort was made to bridge differences. Catherine was expected to adapt fully to England, while England showed minimal curiosity about her world. Her request for tea was not indulgence. It was familiarity. The ale offered in its place symbolized substitution rather than understanding. Over time, Catherine adjusted. She learned English, navigated court life more skillfully, and found moments of acceptance. But the marriage never became emotionally fulfilling. Charles remained a king of appetite and distraction. Catherine remained a queen of patience and endurance. They coexisted rather than connected. After Charles's death in 1685, Catherine returned to Portugal, having survived political hostility, personal disappointment, and cultural isolation. Her influence on England lingered not through airs or policy, but through habits and customs that slowly took root. Tea, once alien, became national ritual. Catherine herself faded quietly from English life, her personal sacrifices largely forgotten. Looking back, the marriage of Charles II and Catherine of Braganza illustrates how royal unions can succeed politically while failing emotionally. It shows how power can coexist with profound misunderstanding, and how something as small as a drink request can expose the distance between two worlds forced together by necessity. And as royal history continued, those distances would sometimes grow even more dramatic. In the next marriage, suspicion would replace confusion, storms would replace silence, and a king would become convinced that unseen forces were working against his bride, turning a royal wedding into a hunt for enemies no one else could see. 21. King James I and Anne of Denmark, 1589. When King James VI of Scotland, later King James I of England, married Anne of Denmark in 1589, the union began not with celebration but with fear, suspicion, and an extraordinary belief that unseen enemies were trying to prevent the marriage itself. The shocking truth behind this royal union is not a scandal of infidelity or insult, but something far stranger. James became convinced that hostile forces were deliberately raising storms to stop his bride from reaching him, and this belief would permanently shape his worldview, his reign, and his obsession with hidden threats. Anne of Denmark was only 14 when the marriage was arranged, a standard diplomatic age for the time, but still emotionally daunting. She was poised, intelligent, and raised in a cultured Scandinavian court that valued ceremony and refinement. James, by contrast, was already 23 and deeply shaped by a turbulent upbringing. He had grown up surrounded by conspiracies, regents, and violent political upheaval. From an early age, he learned to believe that danger often lurked behind ordinary events. That mindset came roaring to the surface when Anne attempted to sail from Denmark to Scotland to complete the marriage in person. Her fleet encountered violent storms and was forced to turn back repeatedly. Ships were damaged, sailors were injured. The crossing failed more than once. To modern eyes, this was unfortunate but unsurprising. North Sea travel in the late 16th century was notoriously dangerous. To James, however, it felt intentional. Rather than waiting passively, James became increasingly agitated. He convinced himself that these storms were not random acts of nature, but deliberate attacks meant to destroy his bride before she reached him. His imagination filled in the blanks with alarming certainty. Someone, somewhere, was trying to stop this marriage. Someone was working against him. In a move that stunned his court, James decided to take matters into his own hands. Instead of waiting for Anne to reach Scotland, he sailed to Denmark himself in winter, an extraordinary and risky decision for a king. This act has often been romanticized as devotion, but it was also driven by urgency and suspicion. James needed to see Anne safely secured. He needed to confront the threat directly, whatever form he believed it took. The couple were married in Denmark before eventually returning to Scotland together. Yet James's anxiety did not fade with Anne's arrival. Instead, it intensified. He became fixated on identifying the cause of the storms. When rumors surfaced of women accused of raising bad weather through harmful practices, James seized upon them with fervor. To him, these accusations confirmed what he already believed, that hostile forces had tried to interfere with his marriage. This belief would have lasting consequences. James personally involved himself in interrogations and investigations related to the North Berwick trials, a series of cases in which individuals were accused of conspiring to harm the king and queen by unnatural means. James did not see these events as abstract or distant. He saw them as personal attacks, proof that his marriage had been targeted. What makes this marriage particularly unsettling is how deeply it reinforced James's worldview. Anne of Denmark was not merely a bride, she became central to James's perception of vulnerability. He believed his marriage, his rule, and even his life were under constant threat from hidden enemies. This paranoia did not remain confined to Scotland. When James ascended the English throne in 1603, he brought these beliefs with him. In England, James would later authorize the publication of Demonology, a treatise explaining his views on hidden threats and supernatural danger. The roots of that obsession traced directly back to his marriage journey. The storms, the delays, and the fear that someone had tried to stop Anne from becoming his queen convinced James that danger was not always visible, and that vigilance was necessary at all times. Anne herself, meanwhile, struggled to navigate a marriage shaped by her husband's anxieties. Though intelligent and culturally sophisticated, she found James emotionally distant and unpredictable. Their relationship was complicated by long separations, differing interests, and James's shifting affections. Anne sought independence, establishing her own household and patronizing the arts, including lavish court masques that gave her a public voice and identity separate from her husband. Despite their differences, the marriage produced several children, including the future Charles I. Yet even within the family, emotional distance persisted. James often delegated child-rearing and retreated into intellectual and political pursuits. Anne, sidelined from power, focused on cultural influence rather than direct authority. In retrospect, the marriage of James and Anne is remarkable not for romance or collapse, but for its psychological impact. It demonstrates how personal experiences can shape royal ideology. A failed sea crossing became evidence of conspiracy. Natural danger became perceived intent, and a marriage meant to stabilize alliances instead deepened a king's fear of the unseen. The storms that delayed Anne's arrival were forgotten by history as meteorological events. But to James, they became proof of a hostile world operating just beyond sight. That belief would influence policies, trials, and attitudes for decades, embedding suspicion into the fabric of his reign. This marriage reminds us that royal unions are not only emotional partnerships, but formative experiences. For James, marriage did not bring calm. It sharpened his sense of danger, and in doing so, it changed how power was exercised, how threats were imagined, and how authority justified itself. Yet as intense as James's fears were, they pale beside the rigid certainty of another royal bride who refused to bend at all. In the next marriage, belief would clash openly with ritual, faith would collide with ceremony, and a young queen would make an unforgettable stand by refusing to be crowned alongside her own husband. 22. King Charles I and Henrietta Maria, 1625. When King Charles I married Henrietta Maria of France in 1625, the match was meant to secure peace and prestige between England and one of Europe's most powerful Catholic kingdoms. On paper, it was a diplomatic triumph. In reality, it opened a cultural and religious rift that would haunt Charles's reign from the very beginning. The shocking truth behind this marriage is not merely that it was controversial, but that Henrietta Maria refused to be crowned alongside her husband, choosing instead to watch his coronation from a window, while the public looked on in disbelief. The refusal was not petty or impulsive. It was rooted in conviction. Henrietta Maria was a devout Catholic, raised in the intensely religious French court of the Bourbons. Charles's coronation was a strictly Protestant ceremony, filled with rites and language she could not, in good conscience, participate in. To her, standing beside Charles would have meant endorsing a religious ritual she fundamentally rejected. So she stayed away. For a royal bride, especially a queen consort, this was unprecedented. Coronations were meant to present unity, continuity, and divine approval. By absenting herself, Henrietta Maria unintentionally sent the opposite message: division, distance, and unresolved conflict. The optics were disastrous. Crowds gathered expecting to see their new queen crowned alongside the king, only to discover she was watching from a nearby window instead, physically separated from the most important ritual of her husband's reign. Public reaction was swift and unforgiving. England was deeply suspicious of Catholic influence, still shaped by memories of religious upheaval and foreign plots. Henrietta Maria's absence confirmed the worst fears of many: that the king's new wife was not merely foreign but fundamentally incompatible with English identity. Almost overnight, she became a lightning rod for resentment. Charles, already reserved and inflexible by nature, handled the situation poorly. Rather than smoothing tensions, he doubled down on loyalty to his wife. He allowed her to maintain her own Catholic household, complete with priests and rituals that openly defied public expectation. He shielded her from criticism and resented those who questioned her place at court. What he saw as devotion, many subjects saw as weakness. The marriage itself was emotionally complicated. At first, Charles and Henrietta Maria struggled to communicate at all, separated by language, culture, and temperament. Henrietta Maria was lively, expressive, and emotionally intense. Charles was private, controlled, and rigidly formal. Early in the marriage, tension dominated. Arguments were frequent. Resentment simmered. Yet over time, something unexpected happened. Affection grew. Henrietta Maria softened Charles emotionally, encouraging warmth where there had been restraint. Charles, in turn, became fiercely protective of her. That loyalty would define his reign, for better and worse. He increasingly viewed attacks on her as attacks on himself, and by extension, on the monarchy. Her influence became unmistakable. Henrietta Maria advised Charles, supported his policies, and actively engaged in court politics. This involvement, while common for queens elsewhere in Europe, alarmed English observers. To them, she represented foreign interference at the heart of government. Her Catholic faith magnified every suspicion. Even when she acted out of genuine concern for her husband, her presence intensified political polarization. The refusal to attend the coronation thus became symbolic rather than singular. It was the first visible crack in a reign that would later shatter entirely. It signaled that Charles's kingship would be marked by inflexibility, his own and that of those closest to him. Compromise, whether religious or political, would be elusive. As tensions between Crown and Parliament escalated in the years that followed, Henrietta Maria's role became increasingly controversial. She traveled abroad to seek support, raised funds, and stood firmly by Charles during moments of crisis. To supporters, she was courageous and loyal. To critics, she was dangerous and destabilizing. Either way, she was inseparable from Charles's image and from the growing unrest that consumed the kingdom. Looking back, her refusal to be crowned was not an act of defiance against Charles, but an assertion of personal belief in a system that demanded conformity. It revealed a monarchy struggling to reconcile private conviction with public expectation. It showed how marriage could amplify existing tensions rather than soften them. And it demonstrated how symbolism, who stands where and who refuses to, can carry consequences far beyond the moment itself. When civil war eventually engulfed England, the seeds had already been planted. The public mistrust, the religious fear, the perception of royal distance from common belief, all were present from the earliest days of Charles's marriage. Henrietta Maria's absence at the coronation did not cause the catastrophe to come, but it foreshadowed it with chilling clarity. Royal marriages often aim to unify. This one exposed fault lines instead, and those fault lines would widen until compromise collapsed entirely, leaving the monarchy transformed and the nation changed forever. That transformation becomes even more striking in the next royal marriage, where power would no longer rest with a single sovereign alone. Instead, England would be ruled by two monarchs at once, a towering queen and a shorter, sickly husband whose discomfort was not political or religious but painfully personal and visible every time they stood side by side. 23. King William III and Queen Mary II, 1677. When William of Orange married Mary Stuart, later Queen Mary II, on November 4, 1677, the match was celebrated as a powerful Protestant alliance designed to secure England against Catholic influence. On paper, it was a triumph of strategy, faith, and political foresight. In practice, it exposed a deeply personal discomfort that followed the couple for years and quietly shaped their relationship. The shocking truth behind this marriage was not a scandal whispered in corridors, but a physical reality impossible to hide. Mary was dramatically taller than her husband, and William resented it. Mary stood around 5 feet 11 inches tall, exceptionally tall for a woman of the 17th century. William, by contrast, was about 5 feet 6 inches, frail in health, and plagued by lifelong asthma. When they appeared together, the contrast was immediate and unavoidable. At formal events, Mary towered over him. In portraits, artists struggled to balance their proportions without distorting reality. In public ceremonies, the visual imbalance became a silent talking point. For William, this was no small irritation. He was acutely sensitive to how he was perceived. Raised in a world where kingship was inseparable from physical authority, presence mattered. Height, posture, and command were part of the unspoken language of power. Standing beside Mary, William felt diminished, not politically, but symbolically. He reportedly disliked being seen next to her in public, especially during formal occasions where optics mattered most. Mary, for her part, was painfully aware of the issue. She was gentle, devout, and emotionally attuned, often shrinking herself, literally and figuratively, to ease her husband's discomfort. She stooped slightly in public. She wore flatter shoes. She deferred visibly, even though her royal blood gave her a stronger claim to the English throne than William's. In private correspondence, Mary expressed deep concern about upsetting him, revealing how much effort she invested in maintaining his emotional equilibrium. The imbalance extended beyond height. Mary was the daughter of King James II of England, making her the legitimate heir in the eyes of many Protestants. William's authority, by contrast, depended largely on marriage and political necessity. When the Glorious Revolution of 1688 placed them jointly on the throne, this dynamic became even more complex. England now had two monarchs, one tall, beloved, and English-born, the other shorter, foreign-born, and often absent due to military campaigns. Despite this, William insisted on ruling as king in practice, not merely consort. Mary agreed, stepping back publicly and allowing William to lead governance whenever he was present. When he was away at war, however, Mary ruled effectively and decisively, earning respect for her competence and composure. This duality defined their marriage. Mary had power but restrained it. William needed authority and guarded it fiercely. The height difference became a visible metaphor for these tensions. In public, Mary's physical presence contrasted sharply with her political restraint. William's smaller stature contrasted with his insistence on dominance. The mismatch was not simply physical, it was symbolic of a marriage where reassurance flowed primarily in one direction. Yet this was not a marriage without affection. By all accounts, Mary loved William deeply. She admired his determination, shared his religious convictions, and accepted sacrifices that few queens would have tolerated. William, though emotionally reserved, respected Mary's loyalty and relied on her judgment. Their partnership functioned not through passion, but through discipline and shared purpose. The irony is that Mary's popularity far exceeded William's. She was seen as warm, pious, and reassuring in a time of political upheaval. William, though respected as a soldier and statesman, was often perceived as cold and distant. The public saw in Mary a comforting presence, one that softened William's severity. And yet, it was Mary who continually minimized herself to protect her husband's pride. When Mary died of smallpox in 1694 at the age of 32, William was devastated. His grief was profound and genuine, shattering any notion that the marriage had been purely strategic. He never remarried. In his mourning, it became clear how deeply he had depended on her, not just politically, but emotionally. The woman whose height had once unsettled him had, in truth, steadied him. In retrospect, the resentment William felt toward Mary's height reveals how fragile authority can be when it rests on image as much as legitimacy. Their marriage shows that even kings are shaped by insecurities, and that queens, even powerful ones, often carry the burden of accommodating them. This union marked a turning point in British monarchy: shared sovereignty, negotiated authority, and a partnership defined as much by restraint as by power. Yet it also reminds us that royal marriages are lived in bodies as well as in laws, and that something as simple as height can carry emotional weight far beyond its measure. As the monarchy continued to evolve, power would eventually be challenged not by optics or insecurity, but by one of the most formidable women in medieval Europe, someone who refused to shrink herself for anyone. In the next marriage, height would be irrelevant, submission unthinkable, and the consequences of ambition so explosive that husband and wife would eventually go to war against each other. 24. King Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, 1152. When Eleanor of Aquitaine married Henry Plantagenet in 1152, the union sent shockwaves through medieval Europe. This was not a quiet dynastic arrangement, nor a gentle merging of houses. It was a political earthquake, and the most shocking truth is how fast it happened. Eleanor married Henry just 8 weeks after her marriage to the King of France was annulled, moving with astonishing speed from one crown to a rival one. In the 12th century, this was not merely scandalous. It was an act of breathtaking audacity. Eleanor was no ordinary royal bride. She was one of the most powerful women in Europe in her own right, ruling the vast and wealthy Duchy of Aquitaine. Her lands stretched across much of modern-day France, rich in culture, trade, and military potential. When she divorced King Louis VII of France after 15 years of marriage, she did not retreat into obscurity or convent life. She acted decisively and strategically. Henry Plantagenet, 11 years her junior, was not yet king when they married. He was Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou, ambitious, intelligent, and relentless. By marrying Eleanor, Henry instantly transformed his political position. Aquitaine became part of his domain, creating an empire that would soon rival and humiliate the French crown Eleanor had just left behind. The speed of the marriage made its message unmistakable. Eleanor was not a discarded queen. She was a power broker. The marriage was passionate, dynamic, and initially effective. Henry admired Eleanor's intelligence and authority. Eleanor respected Henry's energy and drive. Together, they formed a formidable partnership. Eleanor was no silent consort. She governed territories, issued charters, and acted as regent when Henry was absent. For a time, they appeared unstoppable. But this marriage was never built on submission. Eleanor had already lived as a queen, led courts, and traveled extensively. She had opinions, expectations, and a strong sense of autonomy. Henry, for all his brilliance, expected obedience, especially as his power grew. The very qualities that attracted him to Eleanor eventually became sources of conflict. Their household was enormous. They had 8 children, including future kings Richard I and John. Yet family life was anything but harmonious. Henry's frequent absences, relentless control, and public relationships with other women created tension that never fully healed. Eleanor, increasingly sidelined, grew resentful of being treated as an accessory rather than an equal. The breaking point came not quietly, but violently. Eleanor supported her sons when they rebelled against Henry in 1173, a move that shocked Europe. A queen taking the side of her children against her own husband was unthinkable. For Henry, it was betrayal of the highest order. For Eleanor, it was resistance. Henry responded ruthlessly. Eleanor was arrested and imprisoned, initially confined under heavy guard, later moved between castles. She would spend roughly 16 years in captivity, largely isolated from public life. This was not a symbolic punishment. It was a calculated removal of one of the most powerful women in Europe from the political stage. Yet even in confinement, Eleanor was not defeated. She survived. She waited. When Henry died in 1189, Eleanor was released almost immediately. The transformation was dramatic. She re-emerged not as a broken widow, but as a queen mother with renewed authority. She governed on behalf of her son Richard the Lionheart, negotiated alliances, and traveled extensively, even into her 70s. The woman Henry had tried to silence became one of the most influential figures of the medieval world. Looking back, the speed of Eleanor's remarriage tells us everything about her character. She did not drift from one marriage to another. She chose, calculated, and acted. Marrying Henry was not an emotional rebound. It was a declaration of independence and power. By aligning herself with a rising force rather than clinging to a failing one, she reshaped the balance of European politics. The marriage of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine was explosive because it united 2 dominant personalities who refused to bend. It produced kings, wars, rebellions, and an empire. But it could not sustain harmony. This was not a marriage that failed quietly. It failed loudly, publicly, and with consequences that echoed for generations. In many ways, Eleanor was centuries ahead of her time. She expected partnership, autonomy, and respect in an era that offered women obedience and silence. Henry expected loyalty without challenge. Neither was willing to surrender. The result was one of the most dramatic royal marriages ever recorded, one that ended not in reconciliation, but in imprisonment and political warfare. And yet, for all its chaos, this marriage changed history. Without Eleanor's lands, Henry's empire would never have existed. Without Henry's ambition, Eleanor's power might have remained regional rather than continental. Their union was disastrous emotionally, but transformative politically. As royal history moves forward, the lesson becomes darker rather than brighter. Because while Eleanor survived her marriage and reclaimed her power, another royal bride would not. In the next union, betrayal would be met not with imprisonment, but with total erasure, ending a marriage not in rebellion or exile, but in lifelong captivity that erased a woman from history while her husband ascended to the throne unchallenged. 25. King George IV and Sophia, Dorothea of Celle, 1682. When George, Elector of Hanover, later King George I of Great Britain, married Sophia Dorothea of Celle in 1682, the union was engineered with cold precision and almost no regard for affection. This was not a marriage meant to thrive. It was meant to solve a problem. The shocking truth behind it is not merely that the couple grew apart, but that when the marriage collapsed, George responded by erasing his wife from life itself, imprisoning her for 32 years and forbidding her from ever seeing her children again. Sophia Dorothea was not powerless. She was the only daughter of George William of Brunswick-Lüneburg and brought with her a significant inheritance. Her marriage to George consolidated territory and wealth within the Hanoverian family, keeping assets from drifting to rival houses. From the start, the match was transactional. George resented being forced into it. Sophia Dorothea resented being treated as property rather than partner. Neither entered the marriage with illusions. Their incompatibility was immediate. George was rigid, emotionally distant, and openly dismissive. He pursued other relationships almost from the beginning, barely attempting discretion. Sophia Dorothea, young and isolated in a foreign court, found herself trapped in a loveless arrangement with a husband who neither respected nor protected her. The imbalance of power was absolute, and it would only grow. Despite the misery, the marriage produced 2 children, George Augustus, the future George II, and Sophia Dorothea of Hanover. For a brief moment, duty appeared fulfilled. But children did not soften George's hostility. If anything, they cemented his control. Once heirs were secured, Sophia Dorothea's usefulness in his eyes diminished further. The emotional vacuum left Sophia Dorothea vulnerable. She sought companionship and understanding where she could find it, forming a close bond with Count Philipp Christoph von Königsmarck. Whether the relationship was romantic or merely emotional remains debated, but its discovery proved catastrophic. George seized upon it as justification, not just for divorce, but for obliteration. In 1694, Königsmarck disappeared under mysterious circumstances. His body was never found. Almost immediately afterward, Sophia Dorothea was accused of infidelity, divorced, and declared dead in all but name. She was stripped of her title and removed from court without trial or public defense. The punishment was absolute. Sophia Dorothea was confined to Alden Castle in Lower Saxony, where she would remain for the rest of her life. Her imprisonment was not symbolic. It was real, enforced, and unrelenting. She was forbidden from remarrying. She was forbidden from leaving. Most cruelly of all, she was forbidden from seeing her children. Letters were censored. Contact was blocked. She existed in isolation while her husband moved freely through Europe, advancing politically and socially without consequence. When George ascended the British throne in 1714, Sophia Dorothea's situation did not change. She became, in effect, a liability, an inconvenient reminder of a past George wished to erase. A living wife complicated optics. A visible one threatened legitimacy. So she remained hidden, locked away in a quiet castle, while George ruled one of the most powerful kingdoms in the world. Public sympathy for Sophia Dorothea grew quietly over time. Stories of her captivity circulated, painting her as a tragic figure undone by a marriage designed to contain her rather than support her. Meanwhile, George's reputation suffered. He was viewed as cold, unfaithful, and ruthless, traits that would follow him throughout his reign in Britain. Sophia Dorothea endured captivity for 32 years. She died in 1726, never having seen her children again. Her son would become king. Her daughter would marry into royalty. Sophia Dorothea herself would be remembered, if at all, as a cautionary tale. What makes this marriage uniquely dark is not just its cruelty, but its efficiency. George eliminated inconvenience without spectacle. There was no public trial, no dramatic confrontation, no resolution. There was simply removal. In a system where kings wielded unchecked authority over their spouses, Sophia Dorothea discovered the cost of being inconvenient rather than powerful. This union exposes the ugliest edge of dynastic marriage. When love was irrelevant and duty transactional, punishment could be absolute. Sophia Dorothea did not rebel openly like Eleanor of Aquitaine. She did not challenge ritual like Henrietta Maria. She did not provoke scandal like Caroline of Brunswick. She simply existed in the wrong marriage, and paid for it with her life in confinement. In hindsight, her story stands as a grim bookend to centuries of royal unions, driven by power rather than partnership. It reveals what happened when monarchy faced personal failure and chose suppression over compromise. And it reminds us that behind royal pageantry were lives shaped and sometimes destroyed by decisions made without consent. As British royal marriages continued into the modern era, such absolute punishment would become impossible. Public scrutiny, changing values, and evolving expectations would slowly strip monarchs of the power to disappear their spouses. Yet the shadow of these earlier unions lingered, informing every modern royal marriage with an unspoken warning about what happens when duty is allowed to eclipse humanity entirely.